Find out how a sculptor's redesign of the military helmet, inspired by fashion, accidentally saved thousands of lives on the battlefield.
Chapter 1. The Steel Saucer.
The mud of the Western Front in 1917 was not mere dead earth turned to sticky mush by endless downpours, but a living, malevolent entity with almost demonic intentions that seemed to breathe, devour, and digest everything that had the misfortune of standing on it, mercilessly drawing both the living and the dead into its black abyss. The camera slowly pans with documentary rawness along the ruined trench, capturing a grainy, sepia-tinted image of absolute, suffocating hopelessness in which the human figures appear as blurry ghosts lost in a claustrophobic maze of destruction. Into the frame comes Private Miller, a young American soldier whose face, once surely full of naive, youthful optimism and faith in the nobility of the war cause, now resembled a lifeless mask carved from gray ash, dried clay, and unspeakable terror etched in the deep lines around his bloodshot eyes. He stood knee-deep in this thick, stinking goo that clung to his icy water-soaked woolen uniform, dragging him down with the force of gravity multiplied by the leaden weight of his omnipresent exhaustion. He was surrounded by the terrifying geometry of the trench walls, supported by rotting wood and sandbag barricades that seemed to tighten with each passing second, turning the place into an open grave from which there was no escape route. The sepia tones of the sky, brutally filtered by the thick, constantly falling icy rain, and the acrid, yellowish smoke from distant gas fires, gave the entire scene an unreal, nightmarish character, like in an old, badly damaged film documentary in which every single frame is permeated with overwhelming horror and a sense of inevitable end. The air in the trench was unnaturally heavy, thick with the stench of burnt cordite, wood rotting in the mud, toxic chlorine, and the sweet, sickeningly metallic smell of human blood that burned into the nostrils and settled on the parched tongue, making every single breath a painful act of physical suffering, like inhaling liquid lead. Miller tried repeatedly to wipe his stinging eyes with his dirty sleeve, but the gesture only rubbed the toxic mud on his cheeks, increasing the suffocating feeling of confinement and claustrophobia. Somewhere far off on the horizon, like a harbinger of the impending apocalypse, he could hear the muffled, steady roar of heavy German artillery, its low frequencies making the ground tremble beneath his frozen feet with the heartbeat of some ancient monster coming to life. This was definitely no place for human beings. This was the deepest circle of hell, in which once proud men were reduced to terrified, instinctively cowering animals, awaiting their completely blind fate in a wet, muddy tomb, knowing that the only final salvation from this suffering would be a descent into complete madness or a sudden brutal death thrown from the roaring sky.
When the firestorm finally hit, it was not a gradual rising crescendo of noise, but a sudden, devastating, brutal explosion of sound and blinding light that immediately completely disoriented all human senses, mercilessly blurring the line between reality and worst nightmare. The artillery barrage began with the unimaginable force of 1,000 storms and the vibrating roar of falling shells, like the demonic scream of iron being torn to shreds and the sky physically bursting, hit the trench lines with such tremendous force that the air, thick with smoke, seemed to suddenly harden into stone, crushing the soldiers' lungs and brutally driving out the last of the life-giving oxygen from them. In a split second, Miller's world narrowed to chaotic fragments, illuminated by blinding stroboscopic flashes of explosions, casting sharp chiaroscuros that with ruthless precision brought out from the darkness terrifying details of destruction. Gigantic fountains of black mixed with earth bodies gushing high into the sky, broken tree stumps torn into millions of sharp splinters, and distorted the faces of his comrades in arms, contorted in a silent, inhuman scream that was absolutely impossible to hear in this omnipresent, deafening pandemonium. The ground was literally boiling and cracking all around, sending up massive geysers of mud, stone, and jagged red-hot shards of steel that fell back into position like a murderous iron hail, cutting through the air with a terrifying whistling sound that would reflexively raise the hairs on the back of the neck of any man still alive. Each powerful explosion was a direct physical blow, a powerful seismic shock that resonated through the bones, causing the teeth to chatter in the jaw and the head to pound with a dull, unyielding pain, as if the brain itself was desperately trying to escape from the skull in an act of panic in the face of such absolute mechanical destruction. The claustrophobia of the narrow trench, previously only psychologically burdensome, now became a physically paralyzing terror as the massive wooden formwork supporting the walls began to creak and crack loudly under the pressure of the shocks, threatening to bury all the soldiers alive under tons of waterlogged earth. In this unimaginable chaos, amidst a deafening roar that paradoxically and contrary to logic forced the mind into a state of strange, numb void and cut off from reality, Miller clung to the muddy wall of the trench, digging his broken, dirty nails into the wet clay with all his might, trying to curl up into a ball and become as small as physically possible, praying hysterically to all the gods he had long ago stopped believing in on this front for the miracle of survival, while the world around him was consistently and mercilessly disintegrating into atoms in thick clouds of orange fire and acrid black dust, making him realize that human courage is just an empty word here, and life is decided only by blind, heartless chance.
At the center of this apocalyptic, mechanical fury, the only thing that stood between Miller's extremely delicate, brittle human skull and the thick rain of deadly, red-hot steel was Brody's helmet, a piece of standard equipment that, at this extremely critical moment, seemed to be a grim, even extremely cruel joke by desperate military logisticians and staff engineers. The focus of the camera, in this extremely chaotic, full of flying fragments and grainy image of war, fell through an extreme close-up on this terrifyingly shallow vessel, resembling an upside-down soup bowl or even a steel saucer, resting on the head of a terrified soldier with absurd, screaming inadequacy in the face of the surrounding threat. This originally British design, created hastily almost on the knee in response to massive head wounds from shrapnel exploding in the air over the heads of infantry in the early stages of the war, offered protection only against threats falling almost perfectly vertically from above, completely ignoring the rapidly evolving nature and physics of the modern mechanized battlefield. Miller could clearly feel the cold, hard metal brim of his helmet, which at best merely shaded his sweat-drenched forehead, leaving the back of his head, temples, ears, neck, and the entire lower, extremely sensitive part of his head completely, terrifyingly exposed to the blows of the murderous iron. The leather visor inside, thoroughly soaked in his own icy sweat of fear and the ever-present dirt of the trenches, slicked mercilessly against his dirty hair, causing the helmet to bounce and slide dangerously with absolutely every jolt of the nearby shell explosions, requiring constant, nervous adjustments with trembling, frozen hands. As heavy artillery shells exploded in the foreground or at the edges of the trench, spewing thick clouds of shrapnel not from the high sky but directly from the side, rushing parallel to the Earth's surface at speeds well above the speed of sound, the extremely shallow profile of Brody's helmet became tragically, comically useless, providing absolutely no shield to the horizontal streams of kinetic destruction. Every brutal gust of wind from the explosion, Every terrible whistle of a piece of rusty, razor-sharp iron flying just centimeters from the ear was an extremely brutal reminder of this fundamental, inexcusable design flaw. And the constant awareness that the thinnest and most delicate bone of the human skull, the one located at the temple, was constantly exposed to the murderous impact of shrapnel in an unimaginable way intensified the paralyzing feeling of helplessness and absolute exposed sensitivity. For Miller, that steel helmet at that particular moment was no longer any symbol of protection, salvation, or military security. It had become an unimaginably heavy psychological burden, a physical embodiment of the terrible fact that to senior officers and generals sitting safely in headquarters dozens of kilometers away, his young life was only a meaningless statistic in the loss tables. Right next to Miller, squeezed into the same rotting, wet, and stinking hole in the ruined earth, crouched Private Jenkins, a boy barely crossing the threshold of adulthood, with whom only the night before he had shared his last, well-crumpled cigarette and dreams whispered in the darkness of returning to sunny, war-free California, which now seemed to exist in some completely different, inaccessible galaxy. Jenkins' face, illuminated rhythmically by the orange strobe flashes of nearby explosions, was terrifyingly pale, completely drained of blood, and his wide, staring eyes betrayed pure, unrestrained panic that threatened to erupt into uncontrollable madness at any moment. They both created an image of perfect, dramatic contrast, the embodiment of youthful, vibrant energy brutally thrown into the middle of the ancient, painless mud that hungered for their young blood with the patience of an insatiable predator. In that one shared moment of terror, when Jenkins' hands shook so badly he couldn't hold the rifle, Miller felt a sudden, deep surge of solidarity with the terrified boy, the silent bond of the damned, caught in the very same merciless cauldron of destruction from which there was no escape or redemption. For a split second, their eyes met in the darkness illuminated only by the conflagration, and both understood without words the same terrifying truth, that this deep excavation with sandbags in which they find themselves is not a defensive trench, but a slowly closing mass grave prepared for them in advance. The ground shook constantly under their bodies, carrying shock waves straight to their hearts, and each subsequent shell fall in the foreground intensified the unimaginable feeling of claustrophobia, as if the very walls of clay and wood had come to life and were maliciously pressing down on them, trying to crush them before the enemy artillery could. They both wore the same useless steel saucers on their heads, and both of them subconsciously felt the cold, moist air carried by the shock wave caressing their uncovered temples and backs, reminding them every second of the brutal fact that in this industrial hell their lives would be decided not by heroism, outstanding training, or courage, but by the blind vector of flying shrapnel that had no regard for dreams of California or the mothers waiting for letters at home. It was then that one absolutely decisive and macabre moment occurred, which would forever, like an iron mark, be seared into Miller's memory, replaying itself frame by frame in an unnaturally slow motion, with an inexorable, even cruel surgical precision, as if time itself had suddenly decided to stop and place in order to fully celebrate the arrival of death. A heavy artillery shell, probably 150 millimeters in caliber, filled to the brim with deadly explosive and formed of reinforcing steel, struck with a deafening crash precisely on the edge of the forward breastwork of their section of the trench, reducing the reinforced sandbags to a cloud of atomized dust and fire. In this nightmarish slowdown of time, Miller watched in horror as a jagged, irregular, and red-hot piece of rusting iron, the size of an adult's hand and as sharp as a butcher's razor, broke away from the main body of the projectile and began its deadly dance in the air, spinning around its axis at terrifying speed.
This deadly fragment did not fall from above. It did not fly vertically from the sky, as the naive design of their British helmets assumed. Instead, it traveled precisely horizontally, parallel to the plane of the Earth, cutting through the smoky air like an invisible guillotine sent by the god of war for one specific and irreversible purpose. He flew at a height of just 5 feet, dodging the wooden beams with ease and passing at a perfect angle to the huddled bodies of the soldiers, his trajectory absolutely perfect, as if calculated by some malicious mathematician, passing exactly a few centimeters under the lower edge of Brody's helmet, which rested on Jenkins' trembling head. The piece of toothed steel, striking with the force of a speeding locomotive, passed the shallow, saucer-like hood of the helmet with terrifying ease, and, without the slightest resistance, plunged deep into the boy's completely exposed, extremely delicate left temple, shattering the thin skull bone in a split second, and destroying the brain before he could even register any impulse of pain. It was a clash of pure, mechanized, and inhuman industrial power with the defenseless biological fragility of human existence. An act of unimaginable violence in which the shallow helmet, supposedly intended to be the ultimate protection of the soldier, did not in any way, even the slightest, change the fateful trajectory of the fragment, remaining only a silent, useless prop on the head of the dying boy.
Jenkins' hot blood, still thick and dark and pulsating with the fading life that had just been so brutally and mechanically deprived of him, gushed out with an unimaginable force, splattering from top to bottom the left side of Miller's gray face and uniform, painting a macabre scarlet pattern on his mud-covered skin that appeared as black as pitch ink in the grainy sepia light of the burning trench, spilled on old document. Jenkins' body slid limply down into the thick mud, like a puppet cut in half, with all the strings that controlled its movements suddenly and without warning pulled out, and his eyes, a second ago full of unimaginable, throbbing fear, now stared blankly into the dark clouds, glassy and completely devoid of any trace of a human soul. The world around Miller spun violently into a spiral of surreal, bloody nightmare as the deafening roar of falling artillery suddenly and unexpectedly disappeared, replaced by a sharp, piercing, and unbearable screech in his ears, the result of the sudden change in pressure and the powerful shock wave from the imminent explosion. Shocked beyond human endurance, Miller raised his uncontrollable, mud-stained hand and slowly, mechanically, wiped the thick, sticky blood of his dead friend from his own eyelids, trying to free his eyes from the terrifying, bloody curtain, but this gesture only smeared death on his own face, making him look like a ghastly demon of war. In a state of complete, almost catatonic anesthesia and total mental breakdown, his hand slid lower, fingers reflexively, instinctively moving towards his own, still intact but terrifyingly exposed temple, touching the cold, rain-soaked skin just beneath the sharp steel brim of his own Brody helmet, a place that suddenly seemed so pulsating with life and vulnerable. Tracing his fingertips along the unprotected line of his skull, Miller physically felt the ghostly pain of a wound he had not yet received, but which he knew with absolute and devastating certainty could appear at any moment, bringing to him the same indifferent and immediate end that had brought to Jenkins. He realized with devastating acuteness that that steel saucer on his head was not protection, but a promise of death.
As the relentless barrage of fire finally began to subside after what seemed like eons, and the deadly rhythm of the heavy explosions changed from a continuous, blurring roar to sporadic, muffled pops like the hoarse hiccups of a terribly exhausted demon, Miller was suddenly jolted from his stupor by the sergeant's gruff, smoke-laced voice. That guttural roar, barely above the tinnitus in Miller's ears, ordered the handful of survivors to immediately gather their wounded and retreat through the backup line of communications that still existed toward the rear of the front before another, surely even more devastating, wave of massive fire arrived. The escape route to the remote field hospital was a slow, exhausting march through a surreal, deeply ruined and lifeless lunar landscape, where the land had been completely rebuilt and turned upside down by millions of tons of falling shells, destroying all traces of trees, grass, and human life. As Miller struggled to drag his legs, dragging them through the sticky, boot-gripping mud with each painful step, there was a smooth but palpable change in atmosphere in the visual narrative of this nightmare, a transition from the acute, active terror and death looming every second on the front line to the chronic, hopeless, miserable existence of the rear zone. With each meter taken toward safety, the surroundings changed in character, and the dark, bleak, and grainy sepia tones of the trenches, previously lit by explosions, began to give way to the sharp, deep contrasts of the chiaroscuro, creating long, ominous shadows in the falling rain and the flickering light of the few fires lit in the ruined ruins of the French villages. Even though the immediate danger of being torn apart by artillery seemed to be receding for a moment, the psychological burden was mounting, overwhelming Miller's mind with the realization of the scale of destruction. The landscape was strewn with the wreckage of destroyed military equipment, hastily abandoned helmets, and the air still carried the echoes of pain and wailing of those who could not be rescued in time from the muddy hell of the front sinkholes.
The field hospital, hastily set up just a few difficult miles behind the immediate front line, located in the ruined remains of a French barn long abandoned by its owners, its collapsed roof necessarily replaced by huge, heavy sheets of soaked, dark-green tarpaulin, was in fact a grim mass factory of endless suffering and pain. As soon as Miller, barely shuffling, crossed the rain-covered threshold of this improvised vestibule of hell, he was immediately hit by a thick, almost physically tangible, suffocating wave of terrifying odors. The incredibly sharp, penetrating odor of iodoform solution, the irritating respiratory odor of surgical ether, the sweetish, nauseating stench of advanced gangrene, and the omnipresent, overwhelming metallic odor of open human blood that seemed to float in the air under the tarp like a thick red fog, covering everything in its sticky shroud. Inside there was absolute chaos, but organized by the medics, visually intensified by the deep, dramatic chiaroscuro lighting cast by the hissing carbide and kerosene lamps suspended under the roof, which eliminated selected, macabre parts of the space, leaving everything else in thick, moving shadows, causing bloody orderlies and nurses to flit between the beds like ghostly ghosts straight from Goya's canvases. Rows of crude stretchers and discarded pallets stretched almost endlessly into the darkness of the tent, on which lay broken, torn, mutilated human bodies, subjected to frantic, desperate, and in many cases completely futile attempts at repair by exhausted medical staff. The sound in this place was as overwhelming as the smell, a constant, unrelenting symphony of agonized moans, the muffled cries of men, the rasping breaths escaping from burst lungs, combined with the sharp clang of bloody surgical instruments being thrown into enameled bowls, creating an atmosphere of unimaginable, concentrated human suffering from which there was no escape.
In the heart of this terrifying chaos organized around suffering, leaning low over a makeshift wooden operating table made hastily from thick planks and empty artillery ammunition crates, stood silently Captain Arthur Lewis, the chief field surgeon, a figure resembling a tragic hero of a grim drama. This man's eyes were intensely red, with deep shadows under them due to the complete lack of sleep from the last several dozen hours of continuous work, and his face, illuminated from above by the harsh, merciless, cold light of a hissing carbide lamp, resembled a mask carved in old stone of extreme, absolute exhaustion and deep, even existential despair. His hands, clenched in rubber gloves that had lost their original pristine white color after countless amputations so long ago, dipped with a slow, almost mechanized movement into a large tin bowl filled with cold water, which quickly turned a dark crimson shade as another soldier's blood washed away. Captain Lewis was performing the heartless but absolutely necessary triage procedure, known as triage. A mechanical, soul-crushing routine of separating those who had any chance of survival and returning to the front from those who could only be moved to a dark corner of a tent marked for the dying to die in peace in the fumes of morphine. What struck the surgeon the most, and what triggered a growing wave of cold fury and professional helplessness, was not even the total number of wounded brought back from the front, but the terrifying repetition and specific, almost predictable nature of one particular type of injury that he had been dealing with non-stop for the last few days. Head injuries that were medically so completely, absurdly avoidable, if only someone had thought.
With a heavy sigh, Dr. Lewis leaned over another patient lying on the bloody table, a very young boy, barely 20, whose faint pulse was already fading rapidly under the surgeon's fingers, and whose crushed, muddy chest was heaving in very shallow, extremely uneven, agonizing spasms like the last beats of a wounded bird's wings. This soldier's injuries were terrifyingly, even painfully predictable to Captain Lewis, and were the same gruesome cause of growing, choking frustration. A massive, extensive, gaping and bleeding wound penetrating the side of the skull, located precisely and unmistakably in the lower temporal region, where the human bone is naturally the thinnest, most delicate, and least resistant to the kinetic impacts of metal fragments. Next to the silent body, on an improvised table of medical instruments, lay the boy's helmet, the same shallow British Brodie design, resting there completely untouched, without a single deep scratch or deformation from the blast on its hard domed bowl, silently accusing the logisticians of its pristine condition in the face of the destroyed head it was intended to protect. The ironic contrast between the intact, perfectly smooth steel of the steel saucer and the completely ruined, crushed architecture of the human skull below the edge of the equipment hit the surgeon with the force of a physical punch to the stomach. Military equipment designed and mass-produced to save the lives of these young boys at all costs had systemically failed and proved to be a death trap in the face of the merciless reality of modern artillery explosive shells spewing murderous clouds iron in a horizontal plane.
Unable to bear this horrible sight any longer, and feeling a growing, paralyzing powerlessness and rage in his chest that the gross systemic error of the military engineers that had systematically cost the lives and health of so many thousands of wonderful young men, Captain Lewis finally walked wearily away from the operating table. He thus left his exhausted assistants the extremely grim, routine task of covering another dead body with a bloody sheet and carrying it into the darkness. And then slowly, with slumped shoulders, he walked over to his small desk, improvised on a rusty barrel, on which lay in disarray the heavy medical journal bound in black, worn leather of the field hospital. Pulling his blood-sticky gloves off his hands with a sudden movement, with trembling hands aching from fatigue, he grabbed a cheap fountain pen and, in the dim light of a candle core, constantly flickering in the draught, he began to write on the thick paper with such fury, anger, and pressure that at any moment threatened to physically tear through the thin pages of the notebook, documenting in it this dark, endless nightmare. Lewis recorded line by line, with an indifferent, objective, almost cold and statistical precision, the true and terrifying nature of the side head injuries that he diagnosed and tried to treat with such ruthless repetition every day, throwing on paper extremely harsh, accusatory, and condemning words directed against the decision-makers and the flawed concept of the helmet itself, which in the murderous realities of the trenches constituted, in fact, a macabre and tragic illusion of any security, contributing directly to the slaughter of a generation.
At the same time, deep in the cold night, outside the hospital tent, where the driving cold rain was mercilessly turning the entire surrounding ground into one large, vast, extremely slippery, lead-colored puddle, Private Miller sat alone in the dark, his back hunched against an empty, muddy box of large-caliber artillery ammunition, completely cut off in his own mind from the macabre noise of the operation and the desperate cries of pain coming from the inside of the tarpaulin. He was in a state of unimaginably profound, thought-paralyzing, catatonic shock and emotional burnout, and his wide, glazed eyes stared out into the meaningless emptiness of the nightscape, known in military psychology as the terrifying thousand-yard stare, signifying the ultimate breaking of man's will. In his stiff, convulsing hands, still caked with the dried and flaking mud and Jenkins' black, now rotten blood, he held his out-of-stock Brody helmet, that supposedly life-saving, absurdly heavy, useless steel saucer painted a faded shade of olive green. He turned the damned piece of molded metal in his hands infinitely slowly at various angles in the light falling from the tent, staring obsessively at its incredibly shallow side profile with a strange, mesmerizing mixture of morbid fascination, the deepest imaginable disgust, and an overwhelming sense of being perfidiously betrayed by the very system to which he had sworn allegiance. The thick, icy rain poured steadily and steadily over the green, rough surface of the cold metal of the helmet, mercilessly and with surgical slowness washing away those red, gruesome stains that were now the only physical evidence of the murderous act that had taken place only a few hours earlier in the muddy trench, and leaving under Miller's fingers only the slippery, inert, and lifeless steel that now seemed to silently and callously mock his human frailty.
With each drop hitting his helmet, he came to the terrifying revelation that to this gigantic state machinery and generals playing with the lives of soldiers on maps, he and hundreds of thousands of others like him were in fact nothing more than very cheap, extremely easy to quickly replace biological cogs, deliberately and consciously sent into mechanized, brutal slaughter in equipment designed solely to cut budget costs. With each turn of the helmet in his hand, he realized what a great lie he had been living until this morning, trusting that this tin, basin-like shield was intended to actually protect him from the horrors of war technology, when in fact it offered not even a fraction of defense against the horizontal spill of death, exposing his defenseless, life-throbbing temples to the altar of the absolute and ruthless absurdity of military action. It was the moment of the deepest breakdown of every value. For him, the helmet ceased to be an integral and life-saving part of a soldier's equipment and turned into a dark, leaden symbol of an invisible enemy. The institutionalized, indifferent logistical stupidity of the military, which was ultimately much more deadly and lethal than the enemy's iron bullets constantly exploding on the opposite side of the shredded no-man's land, because it was it that sent them to their graves with the illusion of safety. Slowly, with enormous internal reluctance and a shiver of disgust running down his spine, as if at that moment he was voluntarily, without anyone's coercion and with his own hands, executing the final brutal death sentence on himself, Miller lifted this heavy helmet up with both hands and slowly, mechanically put it back on his head, feeling how the terrifyingly cold and hard metal, once again with a suffocating pressure, directly adhered to his wet, dirty hair. When he fastened the wet, worn leather strap securing the helmet under his chin with fingers that were trembling and slippery due to the moisture, he physically and immediately felt with full force how the gusty, scalpel-sharp wind carrying particles of ice mercilessly hit him directly on the parts of the head that were deprived of any physical protection, the back of the head, the soft
tissue of the ears and the extremely thin temples, mercilessly blowing across the places where the delicate skull was visible and defenseless. It throbbed in the unusually fast, panicked rhythm of his strained heart. That blast hitting the sides of his head made him realize immediately how incredibly, terrifyingly thin, even non-existent, in the most literal possible physical sense, was the invisible boundary that separated him in that split second in the trench from the gruesome, bloody, and sudden fate that had befallen Jenkins by pure accident. A boundary as grotesquely narrow as the mere microscopic width of a fraction of a tiny inch that was absolutely and intentionally missing from the structure side of that merciless iron bowl on his head. This painful, icy, and piercing feeling of direct, unprotected cold on the most sensitive parts of his back became for Private Miller's mind a permanent, tangible every second and terrifying physical proof of his own final mortality, a kind of dark prophecy, intensifying to infinity the feeling of bottomless, dark claustrophobia and growing madness that had accompanied him like a shadow, continuously since the first moment descending below the surface into the abyss of the front trenches, and from which there was no, absolutely no real rescue.
The night darkness was slowly falling, becoming thicker and darker every moment over the western battlefront, irrevocably and completely absorbing with its tentacles all the sharp contours of tree stumps destroyed by shelling, huge and deep craters left by air bombs, and the shapes of windswept hospital medical tents. Finally, merging this entire terrifying, monstrous, and sulfur-smelling world of destruction into one, completely indistinguishable, sticky mass. The darkness of the shadows, where the fear of tomorrow became the most dominant and all-encompassing of all forces of nature. In this new, black and hostile reality of the battlefield, the only visible sign of any light on the horizon was the sporadic, orange and silent at this distance, muzzle flashes of enemy artillery many kilometers away, ominously and wordlessly announcing the next hours of night, continuously filled with the loud roar of falling bullets, sudden panic, and eventual death in the mud and dirt. Sitting absolutely still there in the piercing, thick darkness of the wind and rain, with his frozen and bleeding hands pressed deep into the pockets of his thoroughly soaked woolen coat, Miller knew with all the clarity he could muster that although his tortured body had fortunately and against all odds somehow survived the impact of that ghastly day on the battlefront, the sensitive human soul was forever and irreversibly ruined there, pierced by the sharp shrapnel of hopelessness. For he then understood forever, at the threshold of the hospital, in the streams of icy rain washing over the back of his head, this one and most important final, terrible in its nature, devastating and merciless truth of this insane, senseless, mechanized human war. The truth that for him and for his generation there is and will never be any possible way to escape or hide from the fatal blow, when you mercilessly realize that the most deadly enemy that threatens your existence at this moment in this vale of tears is not the soldier hidden on the other side of the barbed wire and the destroyed no-man's land, but your own defenselessness, betrayal, and coldness of this steel object placed on your head, allegedly only and for this sole purpose, completely exposed by the system, exposed in everything by the system, and for this one and only purpose, to protect you from the evil of this fiery world.
Chapter 2. The Sculptor's Commission.
The cinematic transition from the suffocating monochromatic despair of the French trenches to the breathtaking sun-drenched expanse of Evelyn Longman's New York studio is a masterclass in visual whiplash, a deliberate and jarring shift from a world of mechanized death to a sanctuary of glorious, unrestrained creation.
where the grim memories of the global conflict are painted in gritty, sepia-toned washes of endless, sucking mud, and the grainy, terrifying film look of relentless artillery barrages that shattered the earth and the minds of men, the reality of Evelyn's present is a vibrant, high-contrast explosion of Art Deco brilliance and boundless artistic optimism. Shafts of pure, golden sunlight pierce forcefully through the massive, multi-paned industrial windows that line the eastern wall of the cavernous room, illuminating billions of dancing dust motes that float like suspended glowing constellations in the warm, still air. This magnificent cathedral of artistry smells deeply and comfortingly of wet, earthy modeling clay, pungent turpentine, heated beeswax, and the faint, lingering metallic tang of poured bronze, a complex sensory landscape that speaks entirely of life, form, and endurance, rather than decay, destruction, and the fleeting fragility of human existence on the battlefield. Evelyn herself stands amidst this glorious, highly organized chaos, a striking vision of intellectual precision and artistic mastery, her elegant, impeccably tailored period dress protected by a heavy, utilitarian canvas smock that is permanently stained with the pale, ghostly fingerprints of her relentless daily labor. She is surrounded on all sides by the towering, monumental figures of her current prestigious commissions, massive, muscular titans of industry and classical heroes whose frozen, dynamic postures cast long, dramatic, sweeping chiaroscuro shadows across the scuffed, clay-dusted hardwood floor, creating a deep, cinematic focus that emphasizes the sheer, overwhelming scale of her artistic ambition and the profound, almost divine power she wields over form, space, and the enduring legacy of bronze.
Evelyn is not merely a sculptor of superficial, fleeting beauty. She is a relentless, uncompromising architect of the human form, a brilliant artist whose celebrated work is rooted in a profound, almost clinical understanding of flesh, bone, and the agonizingly fragile mechanics of mortality that define the human condition. Her hands, surprisingly strong and incredibly dexterous, move over a half-finished, life-sized clay bust with a rhythmic, almost hypnotic certainty, her thumbs forcefully pressing and delicately smoothing the pliable material as if she were breathing life and breath directly into the cold, gray earth. She understands the human body as a miraculous, complex, and highly vulnerable machine, having spent countless solitary hours rigorously studying ancient anatomical texts, observing the intricate, overlapping layers of musculature in medical theaters, and meticulously mapping the delicate, interlocking protective plates of the human skeleton. For Evelyn, the true, transcendent artistry lies not in the mere superficial replication of facial features, but in the capture of the invisible, dynamic tension beneath the skin, the exact way the sternocleidomastoid muscle anchors the heavy weight of the skull, or the vulnerable, elegant, sweeping curve of the cervical vertebrae as they disappear into the protective, bony cage of the upper torso. Her immense intellectual rigor sets her completely apart from her more romantic, less disciplined contemporaries, demanding an absolute, unyielding perfection in every sweeping line and every subtle indentation, viewing each massive sculpture not just as an aesthetic object to be admired in a gallery, but as a permanent monument to the enduring strength and the tragic, beautiful fragility of the human form in a modern world that is increasingly defined by industrial brutality and mechanized indifference. The profound, intensely focused silence of her creative process, punctuated only by her steady breathing and the scrape of her tools, is abruptly and violently shattered by a sound completely alien to the studio's harmonious rhythm, the heavy, synchronized, and unmistakably authoritarian thud of military boots marching purposefully down the long exterior corridor.
The noise is a stark auditory intrusion, a gritty, percussive reminder of the bleeding world beyond her sunlit sanctuary, contrasting violently with the delicate, rhythmic scraping of her wooden modeling tools against wet clay and the soft, ambient hum of the vibrant city outside her windows. The heavy oak door of the studio swings open to reveal two United States Army officers, their sudden, imposing appearance acting as a massive visual and thematic shock to the system, an immediate injection of steely blue and olive-drab military reality into the glamorous, soft-focus warmth of the 1920s Art Deco environment. They stand stiffly in the doorway, their uniforms a testament to rigid military precision, rendered in a high-definition detail that sharply highlights the rough, unforgiving texture of their thick wool tunics, the polished, blinding gleam of their brass collar insignia, and the creaking, heavily worn leather of their tight Sam Browne belts. This unexpected arrival represents a profound, almost tectonic clash of distinct universes, the rigid, utilitarian, and inherently destructive machinery of the massive War Department invading the fluid, creative, and life-affirming domain of the master sculptor, bringing with them an atmosphere of grim consequence and unspoken tragedy that instantly drops the temperature of the room, casting a creeping, metaphorical shadow of war over the brightly lit, optimistic monuments of her artistic triumphs.
The officers step forward into the light, their movements stiff, formal, and slightly hesitant, introducing themselves with a crisp, practiced military cadence that seems to echo awkwardly and discordantly in the cavernous, acoustically rich space of the art studio. Major Hatcher, a formidable man with a stoic face carved from the very same unyielding granite Evelyn often works with, and Captain Miller, whose tired eyes betray a lingering, haunted exhaustion of surviving the apocalyptic European trenches, present a sharp, undeniable contrast to the elegant, fluid grace of the highly educated woman standing confidently before them. Evelyn slowly sets down her wooden sculpting tools, methodically wiping the wet gray clay from her long fingers with a stained rag, her expression a careful mask of polite, guarded curiosity as she listens to the bizarre, completely unexpected reason for their sudden intrusion into her private sanctuary. They explain with a grim, halting reluctance that speaks volumes of the horrors they have witnessed, the horrific, mechanized realities of modern artillery warfare, describing the relentless rain of deadly, jagged steel shrapnel that falls from the sky like unnatural hail, and the staggering, statistically unacceptable numbers of catastrophic, life-ending head wounds suffered by the brave men trapped in the muddy trenches. They respectfully explain that they have come to her not for a grand memorial monument to honor the fallen dead, but for a desperate, unprecedented engineering solution to save the living, revealing the shocking truth that the greatest military engineers, metallurgists, and industrial designers in the nation have failed miserably to design a combat helmet that truly protects the complex geometry of the human head, and that they are now turning to the one person who understands the true architecture of the skull better than anyone else alive.
With a heavy, solemn finality that speaks to the desperation of their mission, Major Hatcher unfastens the heavy brass buckles of his worn canvas satchel, reaching deep inside to extract the highly classified object that has brought them to this sunlit room, placing it gently but firmly upon Evelyn's massive, paint-scarred oak work table. The sound it makes upon impacting the wood is a dull, metallic, utterly hollow clunk. An ugly, brutalist industrial noise that seems entirely out of place and deeply offensive among the graceful, silent sentinels of bronze and marble that surround them in the quiet studio. There sits the standard-issue Brodie helmet,
a crude piece of rapidly stamped ordnance steel that looks significantly less like a vital piece of modern protective armor and much more like an inverted, shallow soup bowl, its surface heavily marred by deep, violent scratches, a dull, steely blue patina, and the gritty, lingering stains of dark trench mud that powerfully evoke the sepia-toned nightmares of the brutal front line. Evelyn stares down at the object, her initial polite curiosity instantly giving way to a profound, visceral artistic revulsion at its crude geometric inadequacy, her highly trained artist's eye immediately dissecting the clumsy, thoughtless lines of its excessively shallow dome and its dangerously wide, aggressively flat brim that seems designed to catch the wind rather than deflect deadly projectiles. She does not see it merely as a functional tool of modern war. She sees it as a catastrophic, inexcusable failure of fundamental design, a tragically flawed, unimaginative shape that utterly and completely ignores the organic, evolutionary perfection of the human canvas it was supposedly engineered to protect, a piece of dead metal that offends her deeply held, almost spiritual sensibilities regarding the sacred, unbreakable relationship between form and function. Moving closer to the table, Evelyn reaches out to touch the cold, unyielding steel of the battered Brody helmet. Her highly sensitive fingers, which possess an almost supernatural ability to detect millimeter-scale variations in soft clay or carved marble, immediately registering the appalling, fatal flaws in its rushed industrial construction. She effortlessly lifts the surprisingly heavy helmet, critically testing its center of mass, weight distribution, and balance, and immediately begins to deliver a devastating, clinically precise critique that leaves the hardened military men standing in stunned, highly respectful silence. She points out, with the sharp, authoritative tone of a master sculptor correcting her novice apprentices, that the center of gravity is tragically and dangerously misplaced, designed to sit far too high on the apex of the cranium, making the helmet inherently unstable, prone to rocking, and wildly uncomfortable for the soldier during the rapid, dynamic movements required in active combat. Her refined voice rises slightly in passionate, almost maternal indignation as she traces the high, ridiculously exposed rim, forcefully demonstrating how it completely abandons the vital temporal lobe, leaving the delicate, life-sustaining arteries, the fragile ear canal, and the incredibly thin bony plates of the side of the skull entirely naked to deadly lateral shrapnel bursts. She treats the vaunted military helmet exactly as if it were a scandalously poorly sculpted piece of amateur art, mercilessly dissecting its profound failure to cradle the prominent occipital bone at the rear of the skull and its criminal, unforgivable negligence in leaving the vital, highly vulnerable nape of the neck utterly exposed to the deadly descending trajectory of exploding artillery shells and falling debris.
To ensure her devastating, highly technical critique is not merely understood as an abstract theoretical concept, but deeply felt as a visceral, life-or-death reality by the officers, Evelyn sharply turns and strides purposefully over to a nearby wooden pedestal, upon which rests a pristine, hyper-realistic classical bust of a male figure, flawlessly carved from pure white Carrara marble. In a moment of breathtaking cinematic intensity, captured in what feels like an intimate macro-level close-up, her pale, clay-dusted fingers reach out to gently, reverently trace the intricate, complex anatomical lines of the cold marble skull, creating a stark, highly dramatic visual contrast between the soft, living, capable flesh of her hands and the cold, immortal, unyielding stone of her art. She commands the officers' attention, guiding their eyes precisely with her slow, deliberate movements, her fingers dancing delicately over the invisible, zigzagging line of the squamosal suture, sliding down to heavily emphasize the prominent, bony protrusion of the mastoid process located just behind the ear, and finally wrapping her hand protectively around the very back of the stone head, right where the delicate brainstem meets the incredibly fragile cervical vertebrae of the spine. With a chilling,
absolute clarity that cuts through the silence of the studio, she mimics the descending, jagged arc of a piece of hot, jagged steel shrapnel, physically and undeniably demonstrating exactly how the excessively wide, flat brim of the Brody helmet would do absolutely nothing to deflect the immense kinetic energy of the blast, allowing the deadly metal fragments to easily bypass the helmet's useless lip and effortlessly sever the vital nerves, muscles, and major arteries hidden just beneath the thin skin of the soldier's neck. The air in the vast, sunlit studio grows incredibly heavy and perfectly still as the profound, terrifying weight of Evelyn's flawless anatomical demonstration settles firmly over the two hardened officers, their weathered faces paling slightly as they fully absorb the undeniable, fatal reality of the massive engineering failure they have been blindly issuing to millions of young, trusting men on the front lines. Rather than becoming defensive, they counter her artistic precision with grim, horrifying statistics, sharing harrowing first-hand anecdotes from the brutal, unforgiving meat grinder of the Western Front, their solemn words forcefully dragging the narrative lens back into the gritty, sepia-toned, blood-soaked mud of the trenches, vividly painting a terrifying picture of brave, desperate men bleeding out in the freezing rain, simply because the mass-produced steel on their heads was fundamentally the wrong shape. As Evelyn stands silently and listens to the sheer, catastrophic human cost of this bad, uninspired design, the massive emotional gravity of the dire situation drops squarely and heavily onto her own capable shoulders, profoundly shifting her internal perspective from a place of intellectual, aesthetic critique to a place of deep, empathetic realization of immense, life-altering responsibility. She suddenly, sharply understands that this bizarre military commission is not merely a theoretical academic exercise in shaping metal for the sake of visual harmony or industrial efficiency. It is a desperate, sacred, and immensely urgent undertaking where her unique, unparalleled mastery of spatial geometry and human anatomy could literally be the singular defining difference between a young soldier returning home safely to his family or being buried in an unmarked, muddy, flooded grave in a devastated foreign land.
Even amidst the grim, heartbreaking horror of the military officer's dark tales of trench warfare, Evelyn's brilliant, incredibly restless mind is already racing far ahead of the present moment, pivoting rapidly and aggressively to confront the monumental engineering and artistic challenge that now lies before her like a massive, unworked block of raw, intimidating marble waiting to be conquered. The unexpected commission seamlessly transforms in her highly analytical head from a bizarre, entirely unwelcome military intrusion into the most fascinating, complex, and vitally important three-dimensional puzzle she has ever encountered in her long, illustrious, and highly successful career as a monumental sculptor. She immediately begins to mentally calculate the incredibly difficult, almost paradoxical balance required by the parameters of the project. The new helmet must possess enough thickness and structural ballistic density to reliably stop jagged, high-velocity shrapnel and bullet deflections, yet it must remain light and perfectly balanced enough not to snap a soldier's neck or cause blinding, debilitating fatigue during endless, agonizing days of continuous combat in the field. She envisions the radical, highly necessary intersection of profound artistic beauty, absolute anatomical fidelity, and harsh, unyielding metallurgical realities, realizing that she must somehow find a way to forge complex, organic, flowing curves out of rigid, unyielding, mass-produced ordnance steel, creating a revolutionary shape that acts not merely as a crude, heavy lid, but as a secondary, perfectly adapted exoskeleton, an elegant, impenetrable, and harmonious extension of the human skull itself.
Beneath the surface of this highly professional, deeply technical exchange, a subtle, unspoken yet palpable undercurrent ripples through the quiet room.
The inherent, deeply ingrained patriarchal hesitation of the massive military establishment in trusting a woman, even a master sculptor of Evelyn's immense, undeniable renown, with the critical, high-stakes, life-or-death design of frontline military hardware. Evelyn, possessing an intellect as sharp and precise as her finest steel sculpting tools, senses this lingering institutional doubt instantly, but she consciously chooses to counter it, not with defensive emotional indignation or frustrated outbursts, but with an absolutely overwhelming, irrefutable, and highly calculated display of sheer, undeniable competence, metallurgical understanding, and deep historical knowledge. She commands the vast sunlit space of her studio entirely, striding back and forth with commanding presence as she passionately and accurately cites the structural genius of 15th century Italian armorers, the complex physics of kinetic energy deflection via compound curves and sloped armor, and the absolute non-negotiable requirements of anatomical protection, her voice ringing out with unquestionable absolute authority. Under the relentless intellectual barrage of her sheer brilliance and unassailable logic, any residual, lingering skepticism the officers might have harbored instantly evaporates into the dusty air, replaced by a profound, awe-struck respect as they fully realize they are standing in the presence of a true visionary who possesses the exact, incredibly rare combination of artistic intuition, mechanical genius, and spatial reasoning required to solve their seemingly impossible problem. As the full realization of her impending monumental task takes complete shape in her brilliantly analytical mind, Evelyn vividly and powerfully imagines the arduous, transformative, and highly industrial process that lies immediately ahead of her, visualizing the miraculous, almost alchemical transition from soft, forgiving, easily manipulated modeling clay to the cold, rigid, unyielding, and totally unforgiving reality of stamped ordnance steel. She sees the future helmet in her mind's eye with astonishing, high-definition clarity, effectively bridging the visual and thematic gap between the glamorous, soft-focus Art Deco world of her current peaceful studio and the steely blue, heavily textured, grim olive-drab future of the 1940s global conflict, where her brilliant, life-saving designs will ultimately see their truest test and save countless thousands of lives. She meticulously envisions the intricate, highly detailed textures that will comprise the final product, the rough, durable, tightly woven weave of the canvas webbing suspension system inside the shell that will absorb the brutal kinetic shock, the sturdy, sweat-stained leather of the adjustable chin strap that will keep the steel securely anchored, and the smooth, beautiful, sweeping, ballistic curve of the metal exterior that will expertly and effortlessly deflect deadly force away from the fragile, precious cranium. This powerful internal vision is a perfect, seamless, and deeply moving synthesis of two entirely different, seemingly incompatible worlds, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that true monumental artistry is not isolated from the brutal, ugly realities of human existence, but can instead be harnessed, shaped, and powerfully weaponized to provide an impenetrable, elegant shield of grace and strength against the most horrific mechanized forces of modern destruction.
The palpable tension in the room rapidly reaches its emotional and dramatic climax as Evelyn turns slowly back to face Major Hatcher and Captain Miller, her formidable mind fully made up, the profound internal transition completely finalized from a state of intense, detached artistic curiosity to one of profound, unwavering, and deeply patriotic purpose.
The glamorous golden, soft-focus lighting of the Art Deco studio seems to dramatically sharpen and intensely focus around her standing figure, illuminating a fierce, determined, steely resolve in her bright eyes that perfectly matches the very cold, hard metal she has just been asked to completely reimagine and reshape. She confidently extends her clay-dusted hand, formally and completely accepting the monumental military commission, the firm, decisive, and equal handshake serving as a physical, binding seal upon a historic, unprecedented pact between the elevated, beautiful, refined world of monumental bronze art and the desperate, gritty, life-or-death, blood-soaked machinery of a global war. In that single, incredibly defining, silent moment, she willingly and bravely embraces the crushing, immense burden of responsibility, knowing with absolute certainty that her unique, hard-won ability to perceive and masterfully mold the subtle, perfect, flowing contours of the human form is about to be aggressively deployed on a massive, unprecedented industrial scale, tasked with nothing less than preserving the lives and futures of millions of young American men who will wear her art upon their heads into the very blazing fires of hell. With the solemn agreement firmly struck and the immense weight of the future heavy in the air, the two officers offer their crispest, most highly respectful military salutes before turning sharply on their heels and marching out of the studio, their heavy, rhythmic footsteps slowly fading down the long corridor until the immense vaulted room is once again swallowed entirely by its familiar, echoing, and profound silence. Yet, despite the return of the quiet, the sprawling space feels fundamentally, energetically, and irreversibly changed. The very atmosphere is highly charged with a new, crackling electric energy of purpose, and the battered, ugly Brody helmet remains sitting prominently on the oak work table, a grim, steely blue, heavily scarred interloper holding court among the pristine, classical, and idealized beauties of marble and bronze. Evelyn stands completely alone, staring intently at the scarred piece of metal, her incredibly capable hands already twitching with nervous energy, aching profoundly to grab a fresh, massive, heavy mound of wet modeling clay and violently slap it onto a bare wooden armature to begin the sacred, obsessive process of shaping the absolute future of American military protection. As the late afternoon sun begins to set outside the massive windows, casting long, dramatic, sweeping chiaroscuro shadows across the dusty studio floor and painting the statues in hues of fire and bronze, the chapter fades out on her striking, solitary silhouette, standing powerfully and resolutely between the failed, tragic, inadequate steel of the past and the unformed, infinitely hopeful, life-saving clay of the future, a magnificent monument of intellect and unyielding determination set perfectly against the vibrant, glowing, and endlessly reaching skyline of New York City.
Chapter 3. Form Follows Function. Evelyn's studio, once a quiet sanctuary of classical beauty, harmonious proportions, and subtle bronze nudes, underwent a drastic, almost brutal metamorphosis in just a few days, becoming a space where sublime art collided with the harsh, unforgiving reality of global armed conflict. The elegant marble busts and slender geometric figures of the Art Deco era that had previously proudly dominated this room, flooded with soft light, were unceremoniously, almost contemptuously, relegated to dark, dusty corners, giving way to the terrifying artifacts of modern warfare. In a cool steel blue and olive light reminiscent of the austere aesthetics and brutalist utilitarianism of the 1940s, this vast space now looked more like the secret laboratory of a demented military engineer or a macabre field hospital than the luxurious atelier of a renowned sculptor. On the large oak work tables where she had once gracefully sketched flowing draperies and perfect human proportions, now there were towering, chaotic stacks of terrifyingly detailed, large-scale anatomical engravings showing the complex architecture of the human skull with clinical, unemotional medical precision. Next to these grim illustrations lay heavy, bulky, and top-secret ballistics reports delivered straight from the War Office, their yellowed pages covered with endless rows of dry, soulless numbers, complex differential equations, and ruthless graphs illustrating the physics of destruction, including the disintegration speed of steel fragments, the optimal angles of tissue penetration, and the devastating kinetic force of exploding caliber artillery shells. The smell in the studio had also undergone a profound, disturbing change. The subtle, familiar smell of purified turpentine, natural beeswax, and burning oak was completely drowned out by the heavy, damp, and earthy smell of vast quantities of fresh sculpting clay, which in Evelyn's mind constantly, like an intrusive nightmare, mingled with the imaginary, sharp, metallic smell of cordite, gunpowder, and clotted blood, supposedly coming straight from the pages of old military files she was frantically leafing through. Evelyn moved through this new environment dominated by death and steel with an absolutely obsessive determination, and her dark eyes, usually full of dreamy, artistic reflection and gentleness, now burned with the sharp, cold, analytical light typical of ruthless logicians, mathematicians, and field surgeons rescuing torn bodies in the trenches. She was no longer the least bit interested in creating a helmet that was simply a few % better than Brodie's disastrous, outdated, and dangerous model from the previous war. Her new, all-consuming ambition, bordering on pure fanaticism and madness, was to create a helmet that was absolutely uncompromisingly perfect, an impenetrable shield, a masterpiece of protective sculpture that could successfully cheat death itself on the battlefield. All around her, abandoned tools, steel burins, precision compasses, screw micrometers, and files were strewn about in utter disarray, gleaming ominously in the dark, creating a complex web of sharp shadows on the scratched wooden floor that, in her overworked mind, resembled the tangled coils of rusting barbed wire from the trenches of the Somme and Verdun, images that so often haunted her imagination during sleepless nights. This total, almost aggressive transformation of the physical space of the studio, however, was only a superficial external reflection of a much deeper psychological change that took place in the very soul of Evelyn, who, in the face of a global catastrophe, finally and without regret abandoned the concept of creating art solely for art's sake, now throwing all her brilliant sensitivity into a much different mission.
To transform these theoretical, nightmarish calculations into a tangible, physical sculptural reality, Evelyn prepared the perfect base, an extremely precise, heavy plaster cast of a typical young soldier's head, which for her became much more than just a nameless workshop mannequin. She called this cold, white, and motionless cast Tommy, giving him an almost human identity, personifying in him hundreds of thousands of anonymous conscripts from London, Manchester, and Glasgow, boys who were soon to be sent across the English Channel, straight into the mouth of the inferno. The texture of the dried, chalky plaster beneath her hands was lifeless and cool, but for her it was the most important point of reference, a constant in the equation on which she could safely set the layers of her vision, building from scratch a mass that would constitute the thin line between life and violent death. Before she applied even the smallest millimeter layer of clay, Evelyn spent long hours with heavy brass calipers, proportional compasses, and specialized micrometers, measuring with jeweler's precision the distance from the top of the skull to the tip of the nose, the spacing of the ears, the curve of the jaw, and the circumference of the occiput. She traced a dense, complex grid of pencil reference lines on the plaster surface of the head, resembling the meridians and parallels on a globe, which was to serve as an absolutely flawless guide in maintaining the ideal thickness of the future steel armor and ensuring the appropriate cushioning distance for the inner leather and webbing insert. This mathematical, extremely rigorous geometry of the human head fascinated her as much as the golden ratio in ancient Greek sculptures, making her realize that the ultimate protection she was looking for must be perfectly harmonized with these natural proportions, without limiting the freedom of neck movement, field of vision, or spatial hearing, which are as important on the battlefield as thick armor. The process of applying the first layers of dark plastic sculptural clay was the beginning of an extremely painful, long, and full of spectacular failures road of trial and error, during which enthusiasm quickly collided with the hard, non-physical limitations of the material and the human body. Her early, instinctive models, which she built around Tommy's plaster head, were incredibly massive, thick, and heavy, resembling in their clumsy form medieval pots or bulky German Stahlhelms, which aroused in her a deep aesthetic and moral revulsion. She applied more and more clay to what she considered critical areas, trying to use sheer mass to contain the shrapnel's simulated penetration force in her mind, but she quickly realized that she was creating an armor that no human could sustain on her head for more than an hour of intense walking without risking permanent damage to her cervical vertebrae. So she began to meticulously calculate the potential stresses of the neck muscles, analyzing fatigue vectors with loads of several kilograms of steel plate, realizing that in combat conditions, extreme physical fatigue and pain caused by poor equipment balance could be as deadly as an enemy bullet, leading to distraction and fatal mistakes. These first incarnations of her design were completely graceless, being purely utilitarian, ugly structures in which the aesthetics for which she was famous throughout her career were completely sacrificed on the altar of primitive pragmatism. As she looked at those unwieldy, heavy lumps of mud resting on Tommy's delicate plaster neck, she felt a growing, burning doubt in her abilities and realized that creating the perfect helmet was not simply a matter of applying as much protective material as possible, but solving a complex, multi-dimensional biomechanical equation in which weight, center of gravity, protection, and freedom of movement.
After this emotional outburst, Evelyn attempted to move in a completely different direction, towards pure, unemotional mathematics and rigorous descriptive geometry, designing models 3 and 4 as an exercise in the ruthless logic of bullet and shrapnel deflection. Inspired by modern architecture and the raw industrial design of weapons machines, she created helmets that fell at sharp, decisive angles, with flat surfaces tilted at precisely calculated angles of 30 and 45 degrees, which, in ballistic theory, were supposed to ricochet the deadly steel hitting them with maximum effectiveness. From a purely engineering, laboratory standpoint, these sharp forms were brilliant, deflecting impact force vectors with flawless physics textbook efficiency. However, from the point of view of aesthetics, ergonomics, and the human soul, these objects were monstrous, resembling brutalist, dehumanized bunkers placed on human shoulders, devoid of the slightest bit of natural fluidity. Worse still, Evelyn, thanks to her knowledge of space, quickly realized that the flat, sharp planes of such geometric forms, while great at deflecting bullets, would also act as resonance boxes or compression sails in the event of a short-range explosion, catching and focusing the shock wave from below, which could literally snap a soldier's neck with the force of a jackhammer. This cold, purely mathematical dead end finally made her realize one most important truth. Pure science and raw numbers are completely insufficient without the soul-inducing element of human intuition and art. That perfect design cannot be just a graph of forces, but must take into account the organic, fluid nature of the human body in motion. The crucial, almost magical breakthrough came in the middle of an unusually quiet, frosty night, when only a single dimly flickering light bulb was burning in the studio, casting dramatic, deep shadows and creating an atmosphere of high contrast, typical of the classical chiaroscuro that Evelyn loved in Rembrandt's paintings. The physically and mentally exhausted sculptor sat down on an old leather armchair with a cup of cold coffee and began to stare blankly, without much thought, at the sketches and miniatures of classical, ancient sculptures located on the outskirts of the room, in the semi-darkness, fixing her gaze on the small bronze bust of the Greek goddess of wisdom and war, Athena. She looked closely at the slender brown Corinthian helmet that rested on the goddess's head, marveling at how its form seemed to flow straight from the skull, how it organically and softly transitioned from the rounded dome into the protective but not restrictive cheek guards and the elongated occiput guard, creating one harmonious and inseparable whole. In that single crystal-clear second of silence, the true, profound meaning of the famous modernist axiom, form follows function, hit her with the force of a physical revelation, illuminating the darkness of her frustration with the bright light of understanding. She understood that nature is always the most perfect, the highest engineer of all possible. The shape of the skull, the sculpture of the wind rushing over the dunes, the streamlined line of the body of a swimming fish, all this consisted of one uninterrupted flowing line, without sudden angles, without unnecessary resisting bends, allowing the force to naturally flow over the surface of the object and pass it gracefully. Immediately discarding the angular, brutal designs of the previous day, she rushed back to her workstation with a completely renewed, electrifying energy, already knowing with a deep, instinctive certainty in every cell of her body what she must create, how she must guide the clay, and how she must deceive the winds of destruction, carrying shrapnel from the battlefield. When she began work on the final, model number 5, she completely ignored sharp drawing tools.
Then her clay-soaked hands moved to the rear, evolutionarily crucial part of the plaster head, where the line of the helmet had to slope sharply down to protect the back of the head and the critical, lethal medulla oblongata of the brain, without the sharp steel edge digging into the spine of the neck every time a soldier would jerk his head up to try to look at the sky or assess the flight of enemy diving planes. Evelyn drew, and with incredible skill smoothed the clay on the back of her neck, forming a beautiful, organically concave and precisely measured arc, an elegant curve reminiscent of the smooth fall of a sea wave frozen in time just before it crashed onto the shore, which perfectly followed the natural line of the back and neck muscles, providing unprecedented protection against debris falling vertically from behind. To make sure that the back was flawless, she repeatedly grabbed the finished cast of Tommy's neck with the wet lump placed on it and tilted it with all her strength in various directions at the strangest and most extreme angles, checking that the back lip was in no way interfering with the modeled shoulder blades or the frame of the simulated heavy infantry pack. This lower occipital curve, with its perfect cut, which forever defined the extremely characteristic, iconic, dark, and deeply intriguing silhouette of the entire helmet, became for her personally the source of the greatest unalloyed artistic pride. It was simply beautiful, combining the sublime elegance of the best, highest-class avant-garde sculpture with the infinitely brutal and ruthless logic of the mechanics of destruction with which she had to cooperate. Once the basic, massive shape had gained final, irrefutable acceptance in her discriminating mind, it was time for the many-hour process of final polishing and striving for absolute, almost morbid perfection of the helmet's surface, which required a transition from hard work with the hands to the use of the most precise steel scrapers, delicate natural sea sponges, and a special oil to smooth the surface.
Evelyn chiseled the wet, heavy clay with reverent, almost religious concentration, peeling away micrometric layers of material from the surface with surgical dexterity to achieve perfect surface tension, making sure there were absolutely no curves, even the slightest, that could in any way disturb the perfect ricochet of the rushing fragments she had read about in the reports. Under the light of her single, powerful industrial studio lamp, which produced a strong, cool, and focused steel blue light reflecting off the water-sprayed, shiny surface of the smooth clay, the finished project no longer looked like an ugly war prop or a lump of mud. It looked like a stunning, absolutely revolutionary work of modern abstract constructivist sculpture or future aerodynamics. And yet its inherently military nature, ready to defend itself, pulsed beneath the polished surface with menacing, dark energy, promising unwavering security. Concentrated, sharp rays of powerful light slowly and majestically moved along the edges, highlighting each perfectly considered line of the flawless envelope, from the smooth, striking forehead to the gentle, undulating hollows of the ears, to the muscular, smooth protection of the neck at the back, creating a symphony of shapes born of pure deduction and great suffering. Standing a step back in the cool darkness, her heavy arms hanging casually along her tired, aching thighs, her chest heaving with the deep, rapid breaths of the long night, Evelyn initiated a slow, dramatic, almost cinematic take in her mind of reviewing the entire prototype ready for testing, assessing with a critical eye every millimeter of the work done in terms of ballistics, statics, and anatomy. In your imagination.
Chapter 4. The Wisdom of a Committee.
Washington, in 1942, was a vast, insatiable machine whose sole purpose was to devour lives and spit out statistics, and the monumental architecture of the War Department was a perfect reflection of this soulless process. Evelyn walked down long, endless corridors, her footsteps echoing off the cold marble floors, creating a rhythmic, almost military drumbeat that intensified her inner anxiety. A cool steel blue and olive color palette was used here, typical of the wartime reality, where every surface seemed to be covered with an invisible layer of bureaucratic dust and the seriousness of the situation in which the whole world found itself. Narrow shafts of light streamed through the high windows, cutting through the smoky air like the blades of an anti-aircraft searchlight, creating deep, almost physically tangible chiaroscuro contrasts that emphasized the austerity of the place. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of floor wax, stale tobacco, and cheap coffee, mixed with the invisible but pervasive smell of sweat and fear of hundreds of officials making decisions about the life and death of millions of soldiers on distant fronts. Evelyn, holding her canvas bag with the prototype in her hands, felt like an intruder in this temple of logistics and mass production, where art, innovation, and care for the individual were treated as dangerous whims that threatened the established order and delivery schedules. Her heart was beating fast, full of hope that today would bring a breakthrough, that she would be able to break through the wall of military ignorance and save thousands of lives. But at the same time, she felt the overwhelming weight of an institution that had resisted any change for decades. Every detail of her surroundings, from the brass doorknobs to the carefully ironed uniforms of the officers passing her, reminded her that she was entering enemy territory, where rationality was measured in tons of steel melted rather than lives saved, making her mission seem as heroic as it was doomed to failure. But she moved forward, with her head held high, ready to face the Armaments Commission, believing that her work would defend itself. Before the heavy oak doors of the conference room opened in front of her, images from her past began to intersect in Evelyn's mind, creating a painful cinematic collage of memories that fueled her determination. Her eyes flashed grainy sepia-toned images of the trenches of World War I in 1916, where mud, blood, and hopelessness fused into one terrifying landscape of human suffering. She remembered the stories of the veterans, their blank stares and skulls disfigured by fragments that Brodie's primitive, shallow-bowled helmet, which was only a symbolic shield against the murderous force of modern artillery, could not protect. These dark, terrifying visions contrasted in her head with the vibrant, colorful, and geometric shapes of the 1920s, the Art Deco period, when, as a young artist and sculptor, she explored the secrets of human anatomy, learning how form could follow function in the most beautiful way possible. Back then, her world was full of soft, vibrant light, luxurious materials, and uninhibited creativity, and each sculpture was a tribute to the perfection of the human body. Now, in the harsh, expressionless realities of the 1940s, she had to combine these two worlds, the artistic sensitivity and geometric precision of Art Deco with the brutal, terrifying reality of the battlefield, creating something that would be not only an aesthetic masterpiece, but above all, a reliable tool for survival. Her prototype, hidden in the bag, was the fruit of this synthesis, proof that beauty and functionality can and indeed must coexist if they are to be effectively.
Desperate but undefeated, Evelyn turned the committee's attention from the grim past to her shiny, innovative prototype that would provide an antidote to all the shortcomings of Brodie's outdated helmet, a quintessence of modern engineering combined with the utmost attention to anatomical detail. With great pride in her voice, she described the complex geometric curves of the armor, which were designed based on the principles of aerodynamics and kinetics in such a way that the force of a bullet or shrapnel impact was smoothly distributed over the entire surface of the helmet, rather than being absorbed at one critical point, which could lead to metal fracture and fatal skull trauma. She explained how the deeply sloping edges protect the sensitive occipital section of the head and neck, and the ergonomic cutouts at the ears ensure not only comfort, but above all the ability to freely use modern radio communication systems, which was crucial in mobile warfare. The shape of the helmet, illuminated by the sparse light coming through the windows of the War Department, delighted with its elegant, almost architectural form, in which one could see clear echoes of the Art Deco style, combining a love of symmetry, streamlined lines, and uncompromising functionality, creating an object that was as beautiful as it was deadly effective in its purpose. Evelyn also discussed in detail the innovative composition of the manganese steel alloy, with additives improving its impact strength, proving that her design is not only a nice shape, but a well-thought-out protection system based on the latest achievements in metallurgy. Despite her great commitment and irrefutable technical arguments, she felt that her words fell on deaf ears, and the shiny surface of the prototype, instead of arousing admiration, only caused consternation among people for whom beauty and ergonomics were synonyms with unnecessary problems and additional expenses, and not an added value to military equipment. In their dull eyes, she saw that each innovative curve she presented as a breakthrough in ballistics was immediately calculated by them as additional minutes in the technological process, which was a completely insurmountable barrier for them. As if on cue, halfway through her talk about the absorption of kinetic energy by an innovative internal suspension system, the icy wall of military skepticism came crashing down on her as General Hayes raised his hand in a slow, authoritarian gesture, silencing her in a split second, and the atmosphere in the room thickened to the point where it could have been cut with a knife. The camera of the imagination could now zoom in slowly, tensely on the faces of individual officers, showing in deep focus their furrowed foreheads, pursed lips, and eyes that showed no interest in saving human lives, only a cold, heartless calculation of costs and benefits.
Colonel Jenkins, seated to the general's right, began tapping his fountain pen nervously on the mahogany tabletop, introducing an irritating mechanical rhythm into the room that seemed to count down the time remaining until the inevitable failure of Evelyn's project. They began to bombard it with a barrage of technical, logistical questions that did not concern the anatomy or survivability of soldiers on the front lines, but focused solely on the cost of tools, stamping processes, dyes, and the time it would take to convert the giant smoking factories in Detroit from producing flat, primitive pots to multi-stage stamping its complex, curved shape. For these people, deeply rooted in the doctrine of mass production and cost minimization, her helmet was not a salvation, but an engineering nightmare that would require enormous financial outlays and many months of delivery delays, which, in their opinion, an army fighting on several continents could not afford. Their raw voices, devoid of any emotion, resonated like a monotonous.
Chapter 5. A Whisper in the Press.
The atmosphere in the smoky War Department conference room fell like a heavy lead curtain, choking out the remnants of optimism that still smoldered in the hearts of a few visionaries that morning. The military bureaucratic machine, trapped in the sepia-gray frames of its own antiquated understanding of war, delivered its merciless verdict, rejecting Longman's helmet design with a cold, bureaucratic precision that ignored anything that fell outside the established trench patterns. In the air, filled with the smell of cheap tobacco, damp wool, and the sweat of tired men, there was an almost palpable sense of deep discouragement, the emotional weight of failure that weighed on the shoulders of the creators as they watched their revolutionary work end up in a pile of forgotten files. The light filtering through the dirty, dusty windows cast long, melancholy shadows, bringing out the rough textures of military uniforms, the roughness of worn leather belts, and the cold of brass buttons, creating a visual poem about stagnation and resistance to newness. In this space, dominated by military jargon, ballistic stables, and survival statistics, the helmet rested on a scratched oak table like an artifact from a completely different era, incomprehensible to those present, its smooth, almost organic surface gleaming matte, reflecting the remnants of daylight in a way that seemed to mock the primitive brutality of the world around him. For generals and colonels whose minds were still stuck in the muddy, blood-soaked trenches of the first decade of the century, this elegant, flowing line had no tactical significance. It was merely a whim, an unnecessary luxury in a world where only the thickness of steel and the angle of ricochet mattered, not the aesthetic harmony of form. This rejection, although painful and definitive in a military context, did not manage to completely kill the spirit of innovation contained in the metal shell, because even in such a bleak environment, dominated by death and destruction, beauty has an extraordinary, almost insidious ability to survive and find cracks in the wall of ignorance through which it can penetrate into minds ready to receive it. Somewhere in the corner of this room, in a zone of deep shadow where the eyes of the decision-makers never reached, a tiny, unnoticed seed was sown that would soon sprout in a place and time that no one, least of all the military planners themselves, could have imagined, setting off a chain of events leading from total rejection to unexpected triumph in a sphere that had nothing to do with ballistics and everything to do with the human desire to surround ourselves with perfectly proportioned objects. It was at this moment, when the project seemed to be finally dead and buried under a pile of official seals, that its real fascinating journey began, its transformation from a rejected tool of protection into an icon of the coming era, proving that truly brilliant design is universal and can transcend even the strictest boundaries, finding a completely new, unexpected application for itself.
The lens of the story, like in a classic documentary film, slowly shifts the focus from the disappointed faces of military engineers immersed in the dark, desaturated tone of a lost battle to a figure who seems completely out of place in this brutal landscape, the figure of a young, ambitious journalist named Julian, representing a completely different, vibrant world of lifestyle magazines, where the value of an item is not determined by its ability to stop bullets, but by how it resonates with the spirit of the times and aesthetic aspirations of modern society. Julian, sitting in the back rows, far from the mainstream discussion about the thickness of sheet metal and the costs of mass production, watched the whole spectacle with the cool detachment of a professional whose mind works on completely different frequencies, completely ignoring the monotonous, saturated with military heat about ballast tables and angles of incidence.
Chapter 6. Paris, Reawakened.
The Great War, with its endless, suffocating nightmare of omnipresent mud, spilled blood, torn bodies, and rusting barbed wire, finally faded into the irrevocable past, becoming only a dark, painful echo in the collective, battered memory of the entire continent. And Paris, like a mythical phoenix reborn from the smoking ashes of total destruction, decided to brutally throw off its heavy mourning robes and plunge into the madness, a deafening whirlwind of absolute oblivion. The year 1922 brought with it a powerful, electrifying breath of unbridled freedom, which, like a destructive and at the same time cleansing hurricane, swept through all the streets, boulevards, and alleys of the City of Light, washing away the last remnants of war trauma, omnipresent fear, and the soul-paralyzing uncertainty of the future. After long years of agonizing darkness, forced blackouts, and constant nervous listening to the dull echo of heavy artillery coming from the muddy Western Front, the French capital now exploded with an unimaginable riot of bright colors, avant-garde sounds, and a frenzied, almost manic energy that seemed to pulsate with a wild rhythm in every single stone of the historic building, pavement, and in every, even the shallowest breath of its surviving inhabitants. It was a completely new era, the legendary Jazz Age, a fascinating and dangerous time in which each new day was treated as the most precious, fragile gift from fate, and each subsequent night as a perfect, unique opportunity to euphorically celebrate the very fact of survival, to categorically reject the old, stuffy conventions and throw yourself headlong into a hedonistic, loud, and joyful existence that was supposed to compensate for the millions of lives lost in the trenches. The air over the Seine vibrated with exotic sounds that Paris had never known in such intensity before. The syncopated, wild, unpredictable rhythms of American jazz poured brazenly from the wide-open doors of smoky cabarets and nightclubs, mixing into a fascinating cacophonous symphony with the mechanical whir of powerful modern combustion engines, which irrevocably replaced the calm, steady clatter of horses' hooves, symbolizing the arrival of the era of machines and speed. Visually, the entire city was undergoing a fascinating, rapid metamorphosis before the eyes of its inhabitants, shedding the heavy Art Nouveau flowing lines, floral ornaments, and subdued colors of the past decade in favor of the sharp, aggressive geometric forms of the emerging bold Art Deco style, where deep, dramatic contrasts, shiny, cold chrome, perfectly polished exotic wood, and extremely rich, saturated colors symbolized a new, mechanical, and uncompromising reality. In the intense electric glow of the first neon lights, which began to brutally cut the velvety night sky, illuminating the faces of passers-by with an almost theatrical, soft light, absolutely everything suddenly seemed possible and within reach, and the old, rigid, patriarchal rules and rigorous moral norms of the pre-war Belle Epoque appeared to everyone as an outdated, unnecessary, and dusty relic of a bygone, dead world that would ultimately and without glory burned in the ruined, muddy trenches at Verdun and the Somme.
Chapter 7. The Bell-Shaped Idea. Caroline's salons in Paris were bathed in the vibrant, high-contrast light of early afternoon that poured through the huge windows, casting sharp, geometric shadows on the polished marble floors. It was the world of Art Deco,
full of luxury, deep colors of emerald and gold, where every piece of furniture seemed to scream modernity and liberation from the old Victorian shackles. Caroline sat in her plush velvet armchair, but she felt a growing, gnawing frustration that didn't match the pristine interior. Women in Paris cut their hair, threw off their corsets, and began to live at the pace of jazz and roaring engines, but head fashion still lagged behind, trapped in absurd wide brims and cascades of artificial flowers. Just then, the showroom door opened with a soft hiss, and in walked a fashion buyer who had just yesterday stepped off a luxury ocean liner from New York. The woman still seemed to carry the scent of the salty sea breeze, mixed with a heavy, powdery perfume, and her entrance immediately shattered the fragile silence of the studio. The shop assistant, dressed in a bright, geometrically cut dress that was perfectly in keeping with the Roaring Twenties, began talking at machine gun speed about American trends, what was being sold in the department stores on Fifth Avenue, and how much local customers wanted European chic. Caroline listened to all this with polite but cool detachment, sipping hot black coffee from a paper-thin porcelain cup, while her mind was still desperately searching for a form that would reflect the spirit of the new era, a pure, minimalist form, devoid of unnecessary decorations, that would wrap the head of a modern woman like a second skin, instead of being just an archaic, impractical ballast. The conversation revolved lazily about silks, lace, and the fickle tastes of American heiresses, while the merchant, continuing to chatter, began rummaging unceremoniously in her cavernous leather bag with brass fittings. She complained about the monotony of the sea voyage, about the boring magazines she was leafing through in the first-class cabin, and about the lack of real innovation in the market, not realizing that every word she said only made Caroline feel more tired. At some point, among a pile of fabric samples, business cards, and notebooks, her hand came across a crumpled piece of paper torn from some old British technical or military magazine. "Look at this," said the saleswoman with an indulgent, almost mocking smile, throwing the clipping onto the glass table in front of the designer. "I found it in some forgotten periodical on the ship. Apparently, it's a helmet designed for soldiers, invented by some engineer from overseas. Doesn't this look ridiculous? Men can always create something so hideously ugly and call it the height of usefulness. It looks like an upside-down pot." Caroline, at first merely out of politeness, lowered her gaze to the yellowing paper. The light coming through the window fell exactly on the sketch, illuminating it in an almost theatrical way, bringing out every charcoal detail, every line, and every curve from the background. In that split second, just a fleeting blink of an eye, time in the Parisian salon seemed to stop completely, and the sound of the merchant's voice merged into a distant, incomprehensible hum, giving way to absolute silence, ringing in the ears, heralding the arrival of the revelation. The sketch showed Longman's helmet, rigorous and brutal in geometry, with a deep bowl that sat low on the neck and sides of the head, designed solely to protect fragile human life in the mud and desperation of the trenches of World War I. Caroline's eyes widened and her pupils constricted as she took in every inch of this technical drawing, which in her mind went from being a military oddity to an absolute masterpiece of proportions. Memories faded in her imagination.
Chapter 8. Narodziny Cloche'a.
The silence in the studio was almost palpable, thick and thick, interrupted only by the steady, quiet hiss of the heating steam boiler, which stood in the corner like a sleeping mechanical beast. Caroline stood over her massive oak workbench, the top of which bore the scars of thousands of scissor cuts, needle pricks, and dark dye stains, creating a map of her many years of crafting. Sharp geometric shafts of light fell into the interior through tall, dirty windows, in which dust particles and microscopic wool fibers lazily swirled, creating an almost cinematic scenery, full of chiaroscuro, reminiscent of raw documentary frames from the times of the Great War, filtered through sepia melancholy. In the middle of the table, in the very center of this theater of light, lay a crude cone of the highest quality rabbit hair felt, rough, dull, and completely formless, looking like a shapeless lump of clay waiting for the sculptor's touch. Caroline looked at the material with deep, almost obsessive concentration, thoughts swirling in her mind about architecture, about the need to throw away all the Victorian and Edwardian ballast that had been weighing on women's heads and necks for decades. She already hated these monumental wire structures, these dead birds dissected in the name of vanity, these kilometers of tulle, ribbons, and wax fruits that turned the female figure into a walking, absurd altar of excess instead of emphasizing her dynamics and natural lines. She wanted to create something that would correspond to the new, upcoming world, the world of machines, speed, the hustle and bustle of the metropolis, and the emerging emancipation, in which a woman is no longer just a decoration of the living room, but an active, graceful participant of urban life. She brought her hands closer to the felt, feeling its rough, organic texture under her fingertips, absorbing the specific earthy smell of animal hair mixed with tannery chemicals, a scent that for her was the scent of absolute freedom and unlimited potential, the announcement of the birth of a completely new, radical form that was to change the face of fashion forever. The boiler in the corner of the studio finally reached the appropriate temperature, emitting a dull hum that quickly turned into an aggressive, vibrating hiss of steam being released under pressure. Caroline grabbed the brass handle of the valve with thick leather gloves and turned it with practiced strength, releasing a thick, hot cloud of white vapor that instantly filled the space above the copper vat, diffusing the sharp shafts of light into a soft, dreamlike mist, giving the whole scene a dramatic, almost alchemical feel. She immersed her hands, now without gloves, in the boiling, humid air, ignoring the burning pain to which her skin had long become accustomed, covered with a network of small, invisible scars and lumps, silent proof of her dedication to her craft. She took the stiff, stubborn cone of felt, and with a decisive movement she pushed it into the very center of the steam cloud, subjecting it to brutal thermal therapy, forcing the dead, clumped fibers to obey. The documentarian's camera would then focus on macroscopic details, on the beads of sweat beading on Caroline's forehead, on her eyebrows knitted with effort, on the steam condensing on her eyelashes, and above all, on the fascinating process of the physical transformation of the material itself. Under the influence of extreme heat and humidity, the felt slowly began to change its molecular structure, losing its original stiffness and resistance, slowly becoming soft, malleable, almost alive, reminiscent of thick, moist dough or warm animal skin that breathes and yields to the will of its creator. Caroline massaged the hot, steaming material with her burned fingers, rubbing the moisture into it, stretching it gently between her hands, feeling every little lump that needed extra softening, working.
Chapter 9. The Flapper's Crown.
The beginning of this extraordinary revolution in fashion and customs resembled a dramatic cinematic transition between two drastically different historical eras, where darkness smoothly gives way to blinding light. Let's imagine shots in the style of old documentary newsreels from the 1910s, dominated by grainy, vibrating tape, raw and rough shades of faded sepia, omnipresent mud, destruction, and the overwhelming hopelessness of trench warfare. Fear dominated these gloomy, brutal shots, and the only form of protection against the rain of shrapnel falling from the sky were heavy steel helmets, whose round, bell-shaped shapes were supposed to be the final barrier between life and death. However, in the blink of an eye, as if by a magical flash cut, this dark war landscape blurs and transforms, giving way to an explosion of life the likes of which the world has never seen before.
We are entering the Roaring Twenties, an era of jazz, rebellion, and unrestrained freedom, where the visual style is rapidly evolving towards the vibrant, high-contrast Art Deco aesthetic. Rich, saturated colors, sharp, bold, geometric patterns dominate here, and all this is shrouded in sumptuous, soft glamour light, which gives the new reality an almost dreamlike, luxurious character. At the center of this visual and cultural earthquake appears her, the Cloche, a helmet-shaped hat that has shed the weight of military steel and taken the form of soft, elegant felt. It was no longer just an ordinary piece of clothing to protect against the cold. It was a powerful visual statement, a manifesto of rebirth, and a symbol of the final rejection of Victorian corsets and restrictions. The shape that was born in humanity's darkest hours as a shield against death has now, in the glow of shining neon lights and the rhythm of syncopated music, become a crown of life, a triumphant sign of survival, and a symbol of a new, fearless femininity. Let us now focus on the majestic and mesmerizing dance of machines in the gigantic production halls where this global phenomenon was born, revealing the incredible power of mass production in the modern era. Imagine a huge, bustling factory shot from the perspective of dynamic, cinematic camera angles with a deep focus that allows the viewer to notice the smallest details on an almost endless production line. Thick, hot steam hangs in the air, hissing aggressively with every movement of the powerful, heavy cast-iron presses. We see hundreds of workers, women of the new era, in functional aprons, whose hands with extraordinary dexterity and skill stretch moist, luxurious wool felt onto hard, perfectly profiled wooden forms. It is here, in this dark, industrial heart of the city, that an incredible, almost magical alchemy takes place. The raw, shapeless material is brutally and precisely formed into a smooth, seamless bell that will soon decorate the heads of millions of women around the world. The high resolution of this image, reminiscent of the ascetic and desaturated steel blue palette of the later 1940s, highlights every physical texture, the roughness of raw wool, the cool, merciless shine of the polished metal of machinery, the beads of sweat on the foreheads of huddled female workers, and the shiny, worn leather drive belts that set all this complex machinery in motion. With each powerful blow of the press, with each loud hiss of escaping steam, hundreds and then thousands of perfect cloche hats leave the long conveyor belt, ready to instantly conquer the fashion world. This rhythmic, unstoppable production process is not just the simple creation of clothing, it is the mass production of the very idea of freedom, an unprecedented democratization of luxury that makes the most powerful symbol of the new independent woman available to everyone.
Chapter 10. The Unseen Armor.
Paris in the early 1920s vibrated with unprecedented energy, and the city streets resembled a gigantic, constantly changing kaleidoscope of colors and geometric forms. The camera of our imagination, like in a dramatic documentary, moves slowly along the large, shiny shop windows, capturing the high contrast of the Art Deco era, where deep, velvety shadows meet the blinding glow of neon and polished brass. Crowds walk in this soft, even glamorous lighting, which deliberately blurs the hard edges of the brutal post-war reality. Among them, a young woman wearing the latest loose-fitting dress with a low waist walks confidently on the uneven, damp pavement. Her head is decorated with an absolute triumph of contemporary fashion, a tight-fitting, thick felt cloche hat in a deep bottle brown color. This scene, bathed in rich, saturated colors, exudes an illusion of absolute security and carefreeness. The woman smiles at her own thoughts, completely absorbed in the rhythm of the pulsating city, the smell of roasting coffee, and luxurious perfumes. She is unaware that each step she takes on slippery, historic stones is in fact a risky balance on the brink of disaster,
and that what she considers only a refined addition to her wardrobe hides a dormant, raw functionality that in a fraction of a second will be subjected to the most brutal test of physical phenomena. Suddenly, in a split second that slows down to hyper-detailed slow motion in our documentary shot, the heel of her elegant patent leather slipper gets wedged in a treacherous crack between two massive granite paving stones. The physics of collapse are ruthless and mathematically precise. The woman loses her balance, her center of gravity shifts rapidly forward, and her arms instinctively, though too slowly, move up to cushion the inevitable impact. The camera lowers to street level, using depth of field to show the terrifying closeness of the sharp edge of the stone and the woman's delicate, sensitive temple. Under normal circumstances, this specific angle of impact, compounded by the acceleration due to gravity and body weight, would lead to a severe fracture of the temporal bone and consequently to serious internal bleeding. However, at this critical moment, suspended in time, an invisible armor intervenes. The edge of the pavement does not meet the brittle bone of the skull. Instead, it collides with an incredibly densely woven, compact structure of sheep's wool felt, formed into a perfect geometric bell. Designed with obsessive attention to structural integrity, the cloche hat resists the kinetic force of impact. Instead, its thick, rounded wall rapidly compresses, absorbing and redistributing impact energy throughout its rounded, helmet-like surface, protecting the head with an efficiency even undreamed of by military engineers. After the impact, which actually lasted only a fraction of a second, the woman lands on the ground with a dull, muffled thud. Instead of a terrible cry of pain and a dramatic scene, all you can hear is her strangled breathing, full of surprise and social embarrassment. Passers-by immediately rush to help, and their silhouettes cast long, expressive chiaroscuro-style shadows on the pavement. The woman, disoriented but fully aware, allows herself to be lifted up, frantically brushing the mud off her expensive dress. Instinctively, she raises her hand to her head, checking whether her perfect hairstyle and headgear have not been damaged. Under his fingers, he feels a distinct dent in the side of his cloche hat, a deep scratch in the thick felt where the material fought an invisible battle with the gravet. The woman pushes the dent out from the inside with a quick, skillful movement, restoring it to its perfect bell shape, and then thanks the gentleman helping her with a sheepish smile.
Chapter 11. The End of an Era. The golden era, the era of debauchery, endless carnival, and the roaring 20s had to finally collide with brutal reality, and the moment of this collision went down in history as one of the most dramatic turning points of humanity. The screen is initially filled with a stunning montage, vibrating with a riot of colors, maintained in the aesthetics of the highest, most luxurious Art Deco. We see the sharp, geometric lines of skyscrapers rising towards the sky to the rhythm of pulsating, frenetic jazz, flickering neon lights reflected in puddles of champagne poured on the marble floors of illegal speakeasies, and sequins shining in the soft, glamorous light on the dresses of dancing flappers. It is a visual crescendo, an orgy of wealth, carefreeness, and the feeling that tomorrow will never come and financial markets will continue to grow forever. The camera lens, directed with incredible dynamics, swirls among this splendor, capturing smiles full of youthful arrogance, smoke from luxurious cigars, and the omnipresent glow of gold that seems to blind both the heroes of those days and the viewer himself. However, in this perfectly composed image of contentment, a trained eye can detect subtle, almost subliminal signals of impending disaster. A shadow falling a little too sharply, a hand nervously clenching the glass, or sudden dissonant notes in a seemingly joyful melody.
The atmosphere becomes more and more stifling, and the golden colors begin to take on a slightly sickly, coppery tint, setting the stage for the inevitable, painful collapse that, in just a few days, would completely reshape the structure of the Western world and erase the smile from the faces of an entire generation. Suddenly, like a surgical scalpel, the joyful montage is brutally interrupted by grainy archival footage from October 1929, the infamous crash on New York's Wall Street Stock Exchange. The aesthetics of the image change dramatically. We abandon soft, romantic filters in favor of sharp, almost documentary realism, dominated by the cold steel contrast of black and white. The camera focuses in a macro close-up on a telegraph machine spitting out endless rolls of paper tape with stock exchange quotes. The sound of the striking fonts is deafening, like bursts from a machine gun, mercilessly counting down the seconds to the complete annihilation of fortunes built over a decade. We see the terrified faces of the stockbrokers captured in a dramatic, deep chiaroscuro, where the sweat on their foreheads gleams in the harsh light of the lamps. The crowds milling around in front of the stock exchange buildings resemble a stormy, desperate sea. People in elegant hats and expensive suits suddenly lose their position, becoming only helpless pawns in a game whose rules are no longer controlled by anyone. There is a physically palpable smell of panic and fear in the air, and paper tapes, once symbols of wealth, now cover the streets of New York like dirty, mournful snow, trampled by thousands of nervously circling feet. With each passing day of the Great Depression, the light seems to forever escape from the world, giving way to deep, gloomy shadows that lengthen on the walls of ruined banks and abandoned businesses. The jazz music that fueled the cities yesterday dies out completely, replaced by an oppressive, unnatural silence, broken only by the wailing of the wind in empty alleys and the sound of slow, heavy footsteps of people without purpose or hope. The bright colors and the sparkle of precious stones disappear. The color palette in the film becomes drastically limited, dominated by muted ash grays, dirty browns, and icy steel blues, reflecting the coldness and brutality of the new reality. The camera pans with painful precision, using depth of field to show the vastness of despair, over empty storefronts with the words "closed," over abandoned luxury cars that no one knows.
Chapter 12. The Old Problem Returns.
The year 1939 descended upon the world not with the suddenness of a lightning strike, but with the suffocating, inevitable pressure of a collapsing dam. Across the ocean, the fragile piece that had been so desperately stitched together at Versailles was completely unraveling, tearing apart at the seams under the mechanized weight of a new, terrifyingly modern form of warfare. In the hushed, heavily guarded war rooms of the United States military, a profound and creeping dread began to settle over the high command. The visual palette of this era had shifted entirely from the hopeful, vibrant hues of the peacetime decades into a desaturated, steely blue and olive drab reality, where every surface seemed cold to the touch and every shadow hid a new continental disaster. Spread across massive, heavy oak tables were gigantic tactical maps of Europe, their topographical lines obscured by thick, aggressive black arrows, denoting the horrifyingly rapid advance of the German Wehrmacht. These arrows were not the slow, grinding markers of trench warfare. They were the kinetic, fluid symbols of the Blitzkrieg, a doctrine of speed, armor, and overwhelming localized firepower that was currently rewriting the fundamental laws of human conflict. The American military apparatus, observing this storm from across the increasingly narrow Atlantic, realized with absolute, chilling certainty that the oceans would not protect them forever. A massive, unprecedented program of rearmament was initiated, shaking the dust off an industrial base that had been slumbering. But as a new generation of pragmatic, highly educated officers and rigorous engineers began the terrifying task of reviewing the existing United States military equipment, they were met with a shocking, almost offensive reality.
When they opened the massive logistical vaults to assess the defensive capabilities of the individual infantrymen, they pulled out the exact same stamped steel dish that had been rushed into service a quarter of a century earlier, the M1917 Broe helmet. It was, incomprehensibly, still the standard issue, a relic of a bygone era, sitting there as a damning indictment of institutional stagnation and the perilous complacency of peacetime bureaucracy. The atmosphere in the dimly lit briefing rooms was thick with a palpable mixture of urgency and renewed bitter frustration. High-ranking military leaders, their faces deeply lined with the stress of the impending global catastrophe, gathered around heavy wooden tables illuminated by harsh, overhead conical lamps that created a stark, chiaroscuro lighting effect, emphasizing the grim reality of their situation. Deep focus photography would capture the dust motes dancing in the beams of light, settling upon stacks of freshly translated dossiers and terrifying casualty data compiled from the brutal proving grounds of the Spanish Civil War and the devastating early days of the Polish invasion. The data they were reviewing was not just bad, it was a horrifying mathematical confirmation of their worst fears. As the medical officers and tacticians pored over the pages, meticulously cross-referencing shrapnel dispersion patterns and artillery fragmentation lethality, a chillingly familiar pattern began to emerge from the endless columns of the dead and wounded. The statistics were screaming a truth that the military had chosen to ignore for over 20 years. The modern battlefield, now dominated by high-explosive air-burst munitions, rapid-fire mortars, and hyper-lethal mechanized artillery, was producing the exact same traumatic signatures that had filled the field hospitals of France in 1918. The data showed an astronomically high incidence of catastrophic, lethal wounds to the temporal regions and the base of the skull. The old enemy, shrapnel and secondary fragmentation attacking the unprotected lower hemispheres of the brain cap, had returned with a vengeance. It was as if time had folded in upon itself. In the mines,
Chapter 13. A Search Through Time.
In the sterile test laboratory, smelling of machine grease and sharp cordite, and shrouded in the stark, steel-blue glow of fluorescent lights, Major Harrison stood motionless, looking more like a marble statue than a living flesh-and-blood man. His olive-green uniform, perfectly tailored and impeccably ironed, contrasted with the chaos of destruction unfolding on the steel tables around him. The cold, almost merciless light sharpened every detail of the surroundings, bringing out from the darkness the raw textures of scratched metal, torn wool, and worn leather, giving the scene a hyper-realistic, almost documentary character, typical of the brutal realities of the 1940s. The air was heavy, thick with metallic dust and tension that could almost be cut with a knife. Harrison watched as his team, their faces pinched with exhaustion and their eyes puffy from lack of sleep, prepared another helmet prototype for ballistics testing. The mechanical arm of the test machine, like a soulless steel mantis, lifted a heavy weight. In a split second, with a deafening boom that echoed off the concrete walls like an artillery shot, the weight fell onto the rounded surface of the helmet. The sound of crushing steel was like a scream of agony. The prototype that had held so much hope folded inward with terrifying ease, the sharp edges of the broken metal like predatory teeth. Harrison clenched his jaw so tightly that his knuckles turned white as they rested on the edge of the table. Each destroyed helmet in this room represented not only wasted hours of work, but above all, a human life that would have been extinguished in a split second on the muddy battlefields of Europe. Desperation flowed like cold sweat down his neck. It wasn't just an engineering problem. It was a fight against time, a race against death itself, in which every second of delay meant more telegrams of condolence sent to tearful mothers and wives.
The visual sharpness of this moment, accentuated by the depth of field of his own mind's camera, focused on the jagged metal, while the rest of the room was bathed in a claustrophobic, dark chiaroscuro, adding to the feeling of hopelessness and mounting panic that threatened to overwhelm his cold military rationalism. They had to find a solution, but with each piece of steel that was crushed, that solution seemed to slip away forever, leaving behind only the bitter taste of defeat and the smell of burnt metal. The following hours blended into a ghastly montage of destruction and frustration, a visual symphony of destruction in which shrapnel and merciless kinetic force played the main role. Harrison's team worked at a feverish, almost mechanical pace, testing and rejecting one design after another in a series of brutal trials that exposed every last weakness in the armor's design. The ballistic shooting range, lit by sharp spotlights that cast long, dramatic shadows on the concrete floor, became an arena for endless executions. Shrapnel simulators, spewing razor-sharp pieces of iron at thousands of feet per second, struck the steel shells of the helmets again and again. The cinematography of this scene was stark, with deep, desaturated blues and grays, with stark, high contrast that emphasized the brutal physicality of the experiments. Each hit generated a beam of sparks, a short, blinding flash of light that illuminated the investigators' tired faces for a split second, revealing their growing discouragement. Harrison, with his arms crossed, analyzed the trajectories and angles of the ricochets with obsessive precision. He watched as helmets cracked, dented, and sometimes even fell to pieces under the influence of simulated artillery explosions. The piles of broken prototypes in the corners of the lab grew, forming macabre mountains of twisted iron that resembled mass graves of the fallen.
Chapter 14. Moment of Epiphany. The air in the old, dusty library of the military archive seemed thick with forgotten human dramas and bureaucratic stagnation, creating an almost tangible suspension that became harder to inhale with each passing hour. Harrison sat alone at a massive oak table whose surface, scratched and dull from decades of ruthless use, resembled a trench-ravaged no-man's land tortured by constant artillery fire. The clocks in the towers of London had long since struck 3 in the morning, and the deep, impenetrable night beyond the tall, arched windows seemed to swallow the entire outside world, leaving only this one claustrophobic island of light cast by an old lamp with a green glass shade. In the cool, steel-blue light of the 1940s that dominated the rigorous aesthetic of the room, every wrinkle on Harrison's face, every furrow carved by constant stress, responsibility, and chronic lack of sleep became terrifyingly clear, like a topography of years of pain carved on a staff map. He was on the verge of absolute physical and mental exhaustion. His muscles were trembling from overwork, and his eyes were burning as if someone had poured a handful of sharp sand mixed with cordite under his swollen eyelids. Chiaroscuro, a dramatic, almost painterly play of deep pitch-black shadows and bright, merciless points of light, mercilessly exposed his deplorable mental state, giving the scene the character of a hyper-realistic document from the front lines of human endurance. Around him, like silent accusers, were piles of yellowing documents, medical reports, death statistics, and hundreds of useless, rejected ballistic designs, each of which was supposed to be a breakthrough, but ultimately turned out to be just another nail in the coffin of British soldiers. Fatigue was no longer just a temporary physiological sensation for him, but became an independent entity, a parasite that infiltrated his bloodstream, slowing down the flow of thoughts, dulling the acuity of his senses, and constantly whispering cynical words into his ear about the inevitable, final failure of his mission.
In this ruthless documentary frame, in which the texture of the rough wool of his sweat-soaked uniform, the cold of tarnished metal buckles, and the cracked, dry skin of his hands were shown with a microscopic, almost painful sharpness, Harrison represented the ultimate silent desperation of a man fighting alone against the gigantic machinery of war and his own overwhelming powerlessness in the face of the mechanisms of death. Somewhere on the periphery of his tired mind, hidden in the sepia, grainy tones of his memories, ghosts from the muddy fields of the Somme and Passchendaele were constantly hovering around, not giving him a moment of the longed-for respite. In his imagination, which, under the influence of extreme exhaustion, began to blur the lines between harsh reality and nightmarish hallucinations, the walls of the library seemed to be dripping with a sticky, clay-like goo, and the silence of the night was broken every now and then by the phantom whistle of falling shrapnel. He saw how, in slow motion, with devastating precision, hot shards of steel rained down on the defenseless necks and exposed temples of young boys huddled in the wet earth. Brodie's helmet, that supposed triumph of British military engineering that was supposed to be a shield against the apocalypse, was revealed in these visions as a tragic mistake, a flat tray offering the illusion of safety, while the soldiers' ears and backs were left completely, painfully naked to flying death. Harrison almost physically felt the impact of each shrapnel, heard the crunch of cracking bones, and the muffled cries of pain that were drowned out by the cacophony of artillery fire. In the shadows cast by stacks of files loomed the dim figure of John Leopold Longman, a forgotten visionary whose innovative, deep-reaching helmet design from the early years.
Chapter 15, From Felt to Steel. The atmosphere in the main research laboratory of the Department of Ordnance resembled a thick, choking soup of doubt, acrid tobacco smoke, and the ubiquitous metallic dust that swirled in shafts of harsh industrial light streaming through the barred windows. It was a time marked by constant failure, frustration, and pressure that seemed to crush the spines of the engineers working there. It was in this oppressive environment, dominated by shades of steel blue and olive green, where every shadow seemed to hide another failed project, that Harrison forcefully pushed open the heavy oak door. His face, carved with deep lines of exhaustion, glistened with sweat, but his eyes burned with a fanatical, almost mad fire that his team hadn't seen in months. With a heavy, dull thud that echoed off the chipped brick walls and disappeared somewhere in the high steel ceiling, he threw an object that looked like an absurd joke in this harsh, military world onto the scratched, oil-covered oak tabletop. It wasn't another ballistic diagram, it wasn't a steel strength test report, or even a new directive from Washington. It was a copy of a Parisian fashion magazine from the early 1920s, yellowed around the edges and shiny in the center. On the scratched surface of the drawing table, among scattered calipers, crumpled technical sketches, and cigarette butts, lay an object so utterly alien that for a split second the entire engineering team froze, convinced that stress and chronic lack of sleep had finally broken the mind of their chief designer. The team, made up of distinguished metallurgists and veterans who still had in their minds the sepia, grainy, and terrifying images of the muddy trenches of World War I, stared at Harrison with mounting disbelief. The magazine's cover featured an Art Deco photograph of a woman, an image saturated with rich, vibrant colors, sharp, geometric patterns, and striking soft lighting that gave her an almost ethereal appearance. The woman wore a perfectly fitting, low-slung felt cloche hat that hunched her skull tightly, reaching low at the nape of her neck and covering the sides of her face. Benson, the team's chief metallurgist, cleared his throat nervously, rubbing his tired, bloodshot eyes, while Miller, the ballistics specialist, clenched his jaw, holding back a snide remark about wasting their precious, taxpayer-funded time analyzing women's wardrobes in the face of global conflict.
The skepticism in the room was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. The engineers' faces, illuminated by the harsh light of the drawing lamps, contorted into grimaces of disappointment and painful disapproval, dooming Harrison's idea to failure. Harrison, ignoring the heavy sighs and eye rolls, didn't say a single word in his defense, letting a heavy silence fill the workshop space. Instead, slowly, with the reverence of a surgeon, he reached into the inside pocket of his worn tweed jacket and pulled out a transparent sheet of celluloid. On the sheet, with this precise black ink, a detailed diagram of the human skull was drawn, with the main arteries, critical points of the nervous system, and the areas of the brainstem and temporal bone most sensitive to shrapnel damage clearly marked in red. With dramatic aplomb, Harrison placed the transparent film directly over the photo of the woman in the felt hat. In that split second, when the lines of the skull overlapped the edges of the Parisian headdress, there was absolute silence in the workshop, vibrating with tension. The team leaned over the table, the lamplight bringing their shocked faces out of the shadows. The edge of the Cloche hat, designed exclusively for aesthetics and fashion in mind, perfectly lined up to the millimeter with the line of protection of the occiput, covering the most...
Chapter 16. The Million Helmet Gamble. The Aberdeen training ground in Maryland greeted the newcomers with a harsh, almost hostile morning chill that seemed perfectly in tune with the gravity of the upcoming events. The sky was a shade of steel blue, broken by sharp bands of leaden clouds, giving the landscape a stark, high-contrast look straight from the sharpest documentary photographs, permeated with the atmosphere of an inevitably approaching global war. There was a penetrating, metallic smell of wet earth, machine grease, and shark gunpowder in the air, a smell that for many of the veterans present was a dark reminder of past battles. John Harrison, the lead designer, stood at the edge of the carefully raked firing range, his eyes focused on the two armored test rigs. The grainy, faded sepia images of the trenches of World War I were still fresh in his mind, terrifying visions of sticky mud and gruesome head injuries from which Brodie's old British helmet could not effectively protect the soldiers. This bleak past now contrasted extremely sharply with the modern, sterile space of the training ground, where everything seemed more vivid, bathed in the cold light of the emerging era of industrial domination. Harrison was well aware that today was not just a routine test of a piece of sheet metal. It was a brutal fight for the survival of millions of young boys who would soon be sent to the most remote corners of the world. Technicians in olive green overalls bustled around him, setting up time-lapse cameras, calibrating weapons, and preparing mannequins with the precision of an elaborate ritual of modern military science. Harrison took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs, and looked at the prototype M1 helmet gleaming in the pale light. Its ideal proportions drew on the best examples of functional design from the 1920s, combining raw brutality with artistic perfection. This was that one moment, the moment of absolute truth, when cold steel would speak louder than words, and the mathematics of ballistics would deliver the final verdict on salvation. On the first test stand, lit by sharp beams of light from powerful carbon reflectors, rested Brodie's old helmet, commonly known as the M1917, which was shaped like an inverted shallow bowl. Its design, derived from ancient trench warfare concepts, was optimized solely for protection from overhead shrapnel, but left the back of the head and sides of the head completely defenseless against fire from a flat flight path. High-speed cameras, which were the absolute pinnacle of optical engineering at the time, began to rattle steadily, their sound resembling a mechanical pulse counting down the seconds to inevitable destruction. At Harrison's clear signal, the gunner pulled the trigger of his .30 caliber Springfield rifle, and the deafening roar of the shot brutally shattered the morning silence, echoing off the concrete walls of the observation bunkers.
To the unaided human eye, it was just an imperceptible blink, a single flash of fire at the end of the steel barrel, and the immediate piercing clang of steel being violently bent. But in Harrison's adrenaline-fueled mind, time had slowed dramatically. He imagined with incredible precision how a heavy bullet, spinning around its axis at terrifying speed, cut through the cold air, pushed by the merciless force of the expanding gunpowder gases. When it finally hit the thin, outdated sheet metal of Brody's helmet, there was absolutely no deflection or even partial dissipation of the gigantic kinetic energy. In the harsh light, you could clearly see how the old, poorly profiled steel yielded without the slightest resistance, cracking along the material stresses. The bullet penetrated the metal with terrifying, almost clinical ease.
Chapter 17. The Test on the Battlefield.
The cinematic lens descends from the bruised, artillery-scarred heavens of 1944, piercing through the dense, suffocating clouds of a European winter to reveal the sprawling, devastated tapestry of a continent locked in the absolute throes of total mechanized war. This is a profound visual departure from the static, sepia-toned nightmares of the previous generation. Instead, we are plunged into a relentless, surging tide of men and steel pushing inexorably across hostile terrain. Sweeping, epic, panoramic tracking shots capture the colossal scale of the Allied advance, transitioning seamlessly from the brutal, blood-stained sands and churning surf of the D-Day landings in Normandy, where the very water boiled with the fury of interlocking machine gun fire, to the freezing, snow-choked, claustrophobic pine forests of the Battle of the Bulge. The visual palette is strictly, almost oppressively controlled, dominated by a desaturated, grimly realistic spectrum of cold, steely blues, unforgiving ash grays, and the ubiquitous, heavily textured olive drab, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight, exhaustion, and unyielding psychological tension. High-definition cinematography meticulously captures the microscopic, tactile details of this monumental struggle, the rough, freezing, abrasive texture of wet wool uniforms clinging desperately to emaciated, shivering bodies, the deep, mud-caked, frozen creases in worn leather combat boots that have marched across hundreds of miles of ruin, and, most prominently, the endless, undulating sea of M1 helmets. Millions of these perfectly contoured steel pots bob and weave through the environmental devastation, catching the weak, filtered, dying sunlight on their matte, cork-textured surfaces. They are the definitive, instantly recognizable silhouette of the American fighting man, a unified visual motif that stretches endlessly toward the horizon, as far as the camera's deep focus can possibly perceive. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the industrial mobilization is staggering, an awe-inspiring testament to logistical might, yet the dramatic, cinematic documentary style ensures that amidst this vast, impersonal, grinding machinery of war, the narrative focus remains intimately, agonizingly tethered to the fragile human element, meticulously preparing the viewer to cross the threshold from the macrocosm of global conflict into the specific, terrifying, adrenaline-fueled reality of a single, fragile life hanging precariously in the balance amidst the mechanized slaughter. The sweeping grandeur of the macrocosmic war narrows violently, the camera plunging dramatically into the claustrophobic, shattered heart of a bombed-out, unnamed French town, a grotesque monument to the destructive capabilities of modern artillery.
Here, the cinematic lighting masterfully employs a stark, unforgiving chiaroscuro technique, where blinding, violent flashes of incendiary light slice through deep, impenetrable, ink-black shadows that conceal unknown terrors. The architectural devastation is absolute, rendered with hyper-realistic high-definition clarity that forces the viewer to confront the visceral reality of urban combat. Centuries-old stone facades have been pulverized into jagged teeth of masonry, while exposed wooden beams splinter and burn, sending thick, acrid plumes of choking gray smoke spiraling into the steely blue sky. Rain begins to fall, a cold, miserable drizzle that instantly transforms the pulverized plaster, brick dust, and ash into a thick, viscous, sucking mud that coats every surface and drags at the boots of the advancing infantry. The visual contrast is sharp and deeply unsettling, the intricate, historical beauty of European civilization reduced to a chaotic, brutalist landscape of broken glass, twisted iron, and shattered cobblestones. Deep focus photography allows the eye to wander down ruined alleys and collapsed boulevards, creating a profound sense of scale and
Chapter 18. The Silent Legacy. The end of the war did not come with a single sudden boom of thunder, but rather as a slow, exhausting decline in global fever, followed by a dull, haunting silence, broken only by the rustle of turning pages in archives and the faint ticking of clocks in sterile military hospitals. September 1945 brought with it the smell of damp leaves and smoke from burning documents, and the visual palette of the world seemed to undergo a slow transformation, abandoning the desaturated steel blue and olive colors of European and Pacific battlefields in favor of the sharp, almost painful contrast of post-war civilian reality. In one of these stark, high-resolution rooms with sterile detail, deep in the bowels of the War Department's main medical archives, sat alone a senior military surgeon, Dr. Aris Thorne. The complicated shadow-given light cast by a single brass-shaded lamp, casting sharp shadows, brought out from the semi-darkness every deep wrinkle on his tired face, every speck of dust swirling in the column of light, and every detail of the countless stacks of manila folders piled up around him. These paper mountains were not ordinary documents. They were standardized clinical records of human suffering, autopsy reports, X-rays, and dry casualty statistics that had been pouring in steadily from front lines around the world for the past few years. Dr. Thorne, his hands still bearing the invisible marks of thousands of hours spent in the operating rooms of field hospitals, ran his finger along the columns of numbers in absolute silence. The air in the room was heavy with the smell of aged paper, formaldehyde, and dried ink, creating an almost palpable atmosphere of reverie. It was in this isolation, far from the cheering crowds and victory parades, that the surgeon began to notice something that stunned him, a slow, mathematical revelation hidden in a thicket of macabre data. A silent miracle that emerged from the compilation of war medical statistics, forever changing his understanding of what happened on the battlefields. What the surgeon saw was monumental statistical proof of the power of engineering chance, written in hundreds of pages of correlations and ballistics charts. When Thorne began methodically comparing medical data from the First World War and the early, tragic months of the current conflict, an era dominated by Brody's flat, pelvis-like helmets, with data collected after the widespread introduction of the M1 helmet, the difference was absolutely shocking. The reports clearly and relentlessly showed a drastic, unprecedented decline in the number of critical lateral cranial injuries. Brody's helmet, although it protected the top of his head from shrapnel falling vertically from the sky, left his temples, occiput, and lower parts of his skull completely defenseless against the deadly shower of side artillery fragments, shrapnel, and ricochets that furiously ripped through the air at a variety of unpredictable angles.
In turn, the deep, rigorously contoured curve of the M1 helmet, falling with extraordinary grace along the temple and covering the neck, changed the very laws of physics on the battlefield. Hadfield's manganese steel, combined with this specific, almost architectural housing geometry, absorbed the bullet's powerful kinetic energy and, instead of allowing it to penetrate thin human bone, forced the steel fragments to slide along its smooth surface, redirecting the destructive force into empty space. With each report from Normandy, from each atoll in the Pacific, from each ruined European village, the statistics became clearer. Historians and military analysts with whom Thorne worked began to carefully estimate these numbers, reaching unimaginable conclusions. This one seemingly simple change in the shape of a piece of stamped sheet metal saved,